Some nights have a kind of stillness that feels arranged, as if the dark itself has been waiting for you to notice it. And on nights like these, nights where the moon hangs thin as a whisper, and the world forgets to breathe, you and I find each other again, here, in this quiet corner of the hour where stories don't simply entertain, they echo. Welcome, traveler of sleepless hours, to another long drift through the shadows. Tonight, I have 5 tales for you. 5 gentle, creeping threads pulled from the quiet places between memory and myth. They won't scream at you. They won't chase you with claws or teeth. Instead, they'll sit beside you, like someone you used to know, someone who remembers more than you do. We'll begin with a voice calling through the wires, a connection that shouldn't exist and a love that refuses to fade. Then we'll walk into a house where fire has a longer memory than grief. After that, we'll drift down the black water of a swollen southern river, guided by a ferryman who's kept a promise far longer than any man should. Deeper still, into the mountains, where a stone carver learns what it really means to sign your name. And finally, we'll step into a quiet New Orleans funeral home, where a woman of steady hands and a tired heart learns how dangerous it can be to shape the face of someone you once loved. Don't rush. There's time. Time to drift. Time to listen. Time to let the stories find you. So settle in, let the night soften around you, and let us begin. The swapped signal. I used to believe that numbers were empty things, mere sequences without weight or memory. But on the first humid night I spent in my new apartment, a place that still smelled faintly of plaster, rain, and the ghost of fresh paint, that belief loosened in a way I wasn't prepared for. The summer heat clung to the walls of apartment 5C like a slow-moving tide, seeping into the wooden floorboards and the edges of unopened boxes. And as I sat cross-legged on the ground with the windows cracked open to let in what little night breeze existed, I stared at the new phone number I had been assigned earlier that afternoon. It felt, at first glance, like any other reset someone might attempt after a difficult year, and heaven knew I wanted desperately to feel unburdened, to shake free from the lingering ache that had settled inside my ribs since Marisol's death 11 months ago. She had been sunlight in a bottle, and losing her suddenly, violently, senselessly had hollowed me out until I no longer recognized the sound of my own voice. Friends suggested therapy. My mother told me time would soften the edges, but none of them understood that grief doesn't fade. It simply finds quieter rooms to wait in. So I changed my number. I abandoned my online IDs. I told myself that letting go of the digital traces was the first step toward letting go of the rest, even though a part of me knew such logic was flimsy at best. By the time midnight rolled across the city, the low hum of traffic outside had thinned into a barely noticeable murmur, like distant waves brushing a forgotten beach, and the cicadas in the courtyard had fallen silent, as if someone had turned off the world. I lay down on the couch without meaning to sleep, fully intending to stay awake and unpack the last of my things. But exhaustion has a way of pulling you under sharply, without permission, like a trap door beneath your thoughts. The next thing I knew, the digital clock on the microwave, visible through the open doorway of the kitchen, was glowing in the dark, and its bold, unwavering numbers told me a time I had always found unsettling. 3:33 a.m. That strange, symmetrical hour, too perfect to be meaningless, too eerie not to feel like a hinge between one world and another. Before I could fully sit up, my phone vibrated once, a single, clipped buzz that sliced through the silence with surgical precision. I reached for it lazily at first, expecting some automated system alert or late-night promotional text. But that small expectation dissolved the instant the screen lit up, because the message wasn't from a bank or an app or a wrong number. It was from an ID I had erased thoroughly months ago, an ID tied to a woman whose absence had carved a permanent hollow inside me. Marinette, 1990. That was what Marisol called herself online, a name she said she created when she was 14 because she liked the music of it, though she often joked about changing it and never did. After she died, I closed every account, deleted every authentication token, wiped the handles from every messenger app, cleared the archives, even requested permanent data removal from the servers. I wanted no lingering digital shadows, not because I didn't love her, but because seeing her name on a notification felt like being hit by a slow-moving train. Now here it was, glowing faintly against the darkness, as unmistakable as a ghost calling me by name. The message preview revealed only one line, but it was enough to make my breath wobble. "Did you forget me already?" And then something far worse, an emoji. Not the modern version, not the updated glossy variant, but the exact little tilted smile that used to exist in an older version of the messaging software, the one that had been discontinued 5 years ago and removed from the system entirely. That emoji had been her favorite. She used it in the last message she ever sent me. "Be safe. I'll be home by 7. I must have stared at the screen for a full minute before unlocking the phone, half expecting the message to vanish or morph into something ordinary, but it remained exactly as it appeared. The room felt subtly heavier, as if the humidity had gained a consciousness of its own and was leaning inward. Trying to steady myself, I typed with slow, deliberate care. "Who is this?" No answer. I tapped on the profile icon to trace the sender's metadata, expecting to find a linked number, an email, perhaps a recycled user handle. But the system returned nothing, not unknown, but void, as if the account existed outside the boundaries of the platform. Some part of my rational mind began spinning contingencies. Cached fragments, server anomaly, ID spoofing. But none of those explanations could reproduce an emoji file erased from existence. My heartbeat grew louder, steady but intrusive, like the pulse of someone standing too close behind me. After a moment's hesitation, I called the number that appeared beneath the ghost ID, even though the format looked incomplete, more like a phantom entry than a real contact. The call did not ring in the usual sense. Instead, it opened into a hiss, soft at first, then layered, like a thin veil of sand shifting across stone. Beneath that hiss, faint and warbled, I recognized something that made the hair along my arms lift one by one. A melody, a tune I had heard countless nights when Marisol worked late at her desk, humming under her breath without realizing it. She told me once that her grandmother taught it to her, but no one in the family remembered it, and she had never been able to find a recording. Hearing it now through a broken channel felt like someone dragging a memory across the floor, leaving scratches. I ended the call abruptly, my thumb shaking just slightly, a tremor not of fear exactly, but of confrontation with something I had buried. I paced the apartment, searching for anything that could anchor me to the present moment. The shadows looked thicker, the corners felt too aware. The air tasted metallic, as though a storm were preparing to slide down the spine of the night. I tried the number again, only to meet the same static, the same sense of a melody woven through interference. But this time the sound changed, deepened, and beneath it I heard a voice, not Marisol's, not familiar at all, a woman's voice, trembling in a way that made my lungs tighten. She was saying something, trying to form words, but the static tangled around them, muffled them, swallowed them before they reached clarity. I leaned in, trying desperately to understand, and in that moment the call severed so sharply that the silence afterward felt like a blow. I stared at the phone, struggling to reconcile the rational part of my brain with the visceral response climbing up my spine. Maybe the number had been reassigned. Maybe someone new owned it now. Maybe this was all a bizarre coincidence, or the result of poor data handling. I opened my laptop and typed the number into a lookup tool. After a long pause, the screen displayed a simple line of text. Number recently reassigned. Previous owner. Unavailable. Current owner. Private line. No comfort in that. In fact, it made my stomach drop, because the timing felt cruelly precise. Marisol's number had been deactivated after her death. Her messaging ID had been wiped at my request. And now here I was, holding a device that claimed the same number her number had been recently given to someone else. I was seconds into replaying the voice I had heard on the static when my phone buzzed once more. The same ghost ID. My hand shook, gently but undeniably, as I opened the message. "I'm still here, you know." And then, after a breathless pause, "It's cold." Something invisible shifted inside the apartment. The silence became a presence, thick as breath fogging a pane of glass. And before I could think, another notification surfaced beneath the message. This one generated by the phone's operating system, benign in appearance but devastating in meaning. New contact suggestion. Marisol. Possible match. My throat tightened. Logic dissolved. Time seemed to pool strangely around me, as though the night itself had leaned closer, curious about the shape of my reaction. The phone grew warm in my hand, not hot, but alive, like something holding its own pulse. I stood motionless, listening to the faint hum of electricity in the walls, the drip of condensation from the air conditioner, the faraway sound of someone's footsteps echoing in the hallway outside, and beneath all of it, inside the fragile glass rectangle illuminated in my palm, I sensed a presence that did not belong to the living, yet refused to fade. For a moment too brief to trust, I saw the faint outline of a silhouette reflected in the darkened television screen across the room, a suggestion of a woman, a softness of posture that mirrored Marisol's last moment, leaving the apartment the day she didn't return. I blinked, and she vanished, leaving only the still, watchful quiet of apartment 5C. I told myself that grief was a cruel architect, capable of building illusions from memory and longing. But as I stood alone in the humid dark, every instinct whispered a truth I wasn't ready to name. Something that should have remained silent had reached through circuits and reclaimed a voice, and whether it sought comfort or warning, I could no longer pretend that I had left the past behind. The night did not answer. The room did not move. Only the phone breathed once, gently before falling still again in my hand. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night after that second message, though night feels like the wrong word for those hours that followed, because everything in apartment 5C seemed suspended in a kind of dim, viscous twilight that refused to behave like ordinary darkness. Instead of feeling like it was wrapped around me, the shadows felt as if they were standing back, watching me with the quiet interest of someone eavesdropping on a confession they never expected to hear. I spent the time pacing slowly from one end of the living room to the other, not because I thought movement would help, but because standing still made me feel as if the floor itself were tilting beneath my feet, and every time I stopped, the phone on the coffee table seemed to draw my attention like a magnet. I should have turned it off. I should have thrown it across the room, pulled the SIM card out, snapped the battery from its casing, anything but letting it sit there glowing faintly like an ember. But the truth is, no matter how terrified I felt, a deeper pull kept whispering beneath it, an ache shaped exactly like Marisol's absence, reminding me of the sound of her laughter echoing faintly down the hallway, the way she would hum while stirring something on the stove, or how she used to lean against the doorframe when she wanted my attention without interrupting me. Grief is a strange architect, and mine had just built a corridor leading directly back into a place I swore I would never walk again. When the sky outside finally began to pale toward gray, I opened the blinds and stared at the courtyard below. Morning didn't bring comfort. It only revealed how exhausted I was. The air was denser somehow, almost wet, and the quiet seemed to cling like a spider web. I put the kettle on, but even the soft bubbling that followed felt too loud in the apartment, as if the smallest sound might disturb whatever force had reached through the phone during the night. By the time I sat down with a mug of lukewarm tea cradled between my hands, the phone vibrated again. Not a message, just a notification from the service provider confirming that my new number had fully migrated. The timing was cruel, almost mocking. I stared at the screen longer than necessary before opening the settings to block unknown callers. But something stopped me. A whisper of intuition I didn't want to acknowledge. If I blocked everything now, I would also block any chance of understanding what had happened, and no matter how irrational it sounded, I needed to understand. I needed to believe that the universe wasn't bending, that circuits weren't bending, that the past wasn't pushing itself through wires just to reach me. And yet, as the clock crept toward late morning, a thought began to settle in the back of my mind with the unsettling clarity of something that has always been true but only just now revealed itself. Someone else might be receiving messages they shouldn't, too. It took me nearly an hour to gather the courage, but eventually I dialed the strange number again, half expecting it to connect to that same static-filled purgatory. The phone rang once, then again, then a third time, and right before I convinced myself it would go to voicemail, a voice answered, shaky, tentative, undeniably real. "Hello?" The single word felt like stepping onto thin ice. "My name is Adrian," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you..." But the woman on the other end interrupted, as if she already knew why someone might be calling her at an unreasonably early hour. "Did you get a message too?" she whispered, and the tremor in her voice slid under my skin like a cold current. I hesitated because the phrasing was too precise, too familiar, echoing my own shock from the night before. When I didn't respond immediately, she added, "Your number appeared in my logs around 3 in the morning. I didn't answer. I was too scared." Her breathing grew shallow, as though speaking the memory out loud made it real again. "I'm sorry," I said gently. "I didn't mean to scare you. I'm just trying to figure out what's happening." Silence stretched between us, not empty, but full of weight. "Finally," she said, "my name is Mira." Her voice trembled slightly on the second syllable. "This number you're using, do you know who had it before?" My throat tightened. "Yes," I answered. "It belonged to someone I lost." Another long pause. "Mine too," she whispered. "My boyfriend. He died last year. I've been trying to let go, but sometimes the phone acts strange, especially around certain dates. I changed my number 2 weeks ago. I thought it would help." A deep, uneasy recognition passed through me like a shadow slipping into place. 2 people, 2 losses, 2 recycled numbers, 2 ghosts of digital identities we both thought we had buried. "Did you get something last night?" I asked quietly. "A message?" Mira exhaled a shaky breath. "Not a message," she said. "A call." Her voice dipped lower. I heard someone breathing, and then I heard him. Or I thought I did. I heard someone whisper my name, but it wasn't him, not really, just the shape of his voice, like someone trying to imitate it through a wall. My heart lurched. Did it sound distorted? Like it was coming through static? "Yes," she breathed, almost like a damaged recording. For a moment, neither of us spoke, suspended in the chilling symmetry of our experiences. Then she asked the question I had feared she would. "What about you? Did you hear someone?" I swallowed hard. "Not the person I expected," I said. "Someone else. A woman. Afraid. I don't think she meant to reach me." Mira inhaled sharply, as if absorbing a puzzle piece she didn't want to fit anywhere. "What did she say?" I couldn't catch the words. The static swallowed most of it. I glanced toward the coffee table, where the phone lay like a paperweight holding down a storm. Then I got another message from an ID that shouldn't exist anymore. Mira's voice went so still it was barely a whisper. Did it use their old username? Yes. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier pauses. It wasn't hesitation, but recognition. Like 2 people simultaneously stepping into the same darkened hallway and realizing it had only ever had one path. "I think," she said slowly, "we're tangled in something that isn't just glitching data." I felt a cold ripple crawl along my arms. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, choosing her words with careful dread. "I mean that maybe it isn't us they're trying to reach." I didn't breathe. She continued in a strained whisper. "Maybe they're trying to reach each other." The room around me seemed to contract slightly, as if the walls had been listening and didn't like the conclusion. A faint vibration buzzed against the coffee table, so soft I almost missed it. I glanced over and felt my stomach drop. Another message. Not from the ghost ID this time. This was from an unknown number. But the preview text was enough to make my mouth go dry. I saw her. I didn't open it. Not yet. I felt the chilling awareness of Mira waiting on the line, sensing my reaction through the sudden quiet. "What happened?" she asked. I forced my voice to remain steady. "I just got another message." Her voice tightened. "From who?" I exhaled slowly, watching the screen as if it might shift under my stare. "I think we need to meet," I said instead, because the sensation rising in my chest wasn't fear alone. It was the dawning understanding that whatever force was tugging our digital strings was growing stronger, more deliberate, less confined to the boundaries of circuits and code. "Not tonight," she whispered, "but soon. I need to know I'm not losing my mind." I almost told her I understood, but the truth was worse. I wasn't sure our minds had anything to do with it. Before I could respond, the line crackled softly. Not loud, not alarming, just enough to feel like something brushing against the edges of the connection. Mira jumped at the sound. I could hear it in her breath. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yes." For a heartbeat, the static thickened, then dissolved. And then the call ended on its own, shutting down so abruptly it felt as if someone had snipped a cord between us. I stared at the phone for a long moment before finally opening the new message. "I saw her. She's looking for you." There was no signature, no number that could realistically be traced. Only the faint hum of the phone settling back into stillness, as if waiting for something else to wake. And somewhere deep inside the circuits, beneath the glass and metal and the illusion of disconnection, something felt awake indeed. Something patient, something cold, something that had waited nearly a year to speak. By the time the afternoon light filtered weakly through the windows, diffused by the heavy humidity that made the world outside appear as though viewed through a fogged pane of glass, I had read the message. I saw her. "She's looking for you," so many times that the words no longer looked like language, but like symbols waiting to unfold a meaning I wasn't ready to confront. For hours I avoided touching the phone, leaving it on the coffee table like a piece of evidence from a crime I didn't know how to describe. Yet its presence pulled constantly at my attention, the way a faint sound in a silent house can hook into your senses before you consciously register what you're hearing. Every attempt to distract myself failed. The quiet was too heavy, too knowing. I found myself wandering through the apartment, touching the edges of unpacked boxes, staring at the blank walls as if expecting them to reveal something, listening to the faint hum of electricity that trembled through the building's bones, and beneath all of that, a deeper rhythm, my pulse, steadily reminding me that something had shifted in the texture of the world, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the subtlety of a door that had been left slightly ajar. As the hours drifted by with the sluggish pace of heated summer air, I made myself sit down, breathe deeply, and dial Mira's number again. The call rang longer this time, long enough for my imagination to begin crafting explanations about why she might not answer. But eventually, her voice emerged a little steadier than before, yet marked by an undercurrent of tremor, as though she had been waiting anxiously for the call she wasn't sure she wanted to receive. She apologized for the abrupt disconnection earlier and confessed she had spent the intervening time researching everything she could about recycled phone numbers, dormant data caches, and inexplicable cross-line interference. None of it made her feel better. "I keep thinking about what you said," she murmured, her voice soft like someone describing a nightmare in the hour before dawn. "That you hurt a woman, and that she sounded afraid. I keep wondering who she could be, and why she would reach us." I hesitated before answering, unsure whether sharing the truth would help or drown her deeper in fear. "I don't know," I finally said, "but I don't think she meant to speak to me. It felt like she was trying to get through to someone else, and I happened to be in the way." Mira exhaled slowly, and I could hear the weight of her thoughts shifting on the line. "Do you think," she asked after a long pause, "that our numbers were swapped for a reason? That maybe something used them?" The phrasing chilled me more than I expected. I found myself pacing again, unable to sit still as I tried to articulate the unease gathering in my chest. "Maybe it isn't about us at all," I whispered. "Maybe it's about them, or the versions of them that still exist in whatever fragments were left behind." Mira's breath hitched, and I could almost see her pressing a hand to her mouth. "I got a message too," she admitted, so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. "It came just after our call dropped. It wasn't from your number. It wasn't from his either. It said, 'He's following the wrong line.'" My heartbeat stuttered at the eerie symmetry of our experiences. "What do you think it means?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "I don't know," she whispered, but it felt like a warning. The moment she said the word warning, something inside me shifted, the kind of shift that feels physical even when it isn't, like a pressure drop before a storm. The quiet in the apartment deepened, almost thickened, and I felt an inexplicable need to check the hallway outside my door to make sure the world beyond the apartment still existed, still held shape. When I peered through the peephole, the hallway stretched empty and soft-lit, the air unmoving. But something felt wrong, not visibly, not audibly, but in that instinctive way a person senses that a mirror has been moved a fraction of an inch from where it used to stand. I backed away slowly, trying to convince myself the unease was nothing more than exhaustion. But the moment I set my phone down, it vibrated sharply, one buzz, then another, like something urgently knocking. When I looked at the screen, my throat tightened. The caller ID showed my own number, not the old one, the new one, the one I had received just 2 days earlier, the number that should not, under any circumstances, be able to call itself. I answered without breathing, the air feeling too thick in my lungs. At first, there was only silence, deep, resonant, the kind of silence that felt like it had weight. Then a faint hum, low and warbling, as though it traveled across a great distance or through water. And then, through that hum, a voice, a woman's voice, fragile, trembling, distorted as though scraped across static. Adrian. My name stretched thin, as if pulled from a broken recording. Every muscle in my body tensed. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I knew immediately it wasn't Marisol's voice. It carried none of her warmth, none of her cadence. This voice sounded strained, frightened, as if someone were speaking while shivering violently, desperately trying not to fall apart. "He can't find her," the voice whispered. "He keeps following the wrong line." My stomach dropped. "Who?" The sharp hiss swallowed the answer. But beneath the distortion, a faint melody surfaced. Not the lullaby I'd heard before. Something else, something newer. A tune I recognized only because I had heard it once at Marisol's funeral. The soft instrumental piece played on repeat while people passed by the casket, murmuring condolences I barely heard. The sound leaking through the phone twisted that melody until it felt wrong, stretched, off-key, like a memory decaying into something feral. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. "Tell me who you are," I whispered. "Please." The voice faltered. "She's cold," it said faintly. "She's waiting. But he keeps trying to follow your line instead. You have to stop answering." My skin prickled. "Stop who?" The static surged violently, and the voice dissolved into a broken wail before the call cut out with a sound like a gasp being strangled. I stared at my reflection in the darkened screen, feeling as if I had just been pushed toward the edge of a cliff I didn't realize I was standing on. I barely had time to process it when Mira called again, her voice shaking the moment I answered. "Adrian, something's happening. My screen, it's showing your old number." My breath caught. "That's impossible." "It's calling me," she whispered. "It keeps calling me." I didn't answer, but the voicemail, "Adrian." I think it's his voice, but it's wrong. It's almost like he's trying to say something through a tunnel. My heart pounded with a slow, heavy rhythm. "Don't answer it," I said automatically, though I wasn't sure why or what danger answering posed. "What if they're trying to reach each other?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What if they're using us as anchors?" I opened my mouth to argue, to reason, to insist none of this made sense. But before I could say a word, my phone buzzed with another incoming call, this time from an ID I recognized instantly. Marinette, 1990. My chest tightened painfully. "Mira," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "I think they're calling at the same time." A soft click echoed on both lines, a sound so subtle and intimate it felt like someone slipping quietly into the room. And then through both our phones, a single voice, layered strangely, overlapping two tones that should not have belonged together, whispered so faintly we almost missed it. "You're not the one I'm looking for." The call dropped. The room plunged into the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, as though something enormous had just retreated into the walls. I lowered my phone slowly, but even without the screen lit, I felt watched, not by eyes, but by something like attention, something searching for the right connection and slipping, again and again, into ours. When Mira finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Adrian, I don't think we're supposed to be part of this. I closed my eyes, feeling the truth of her words settle like cold water in my chest. And somewhere deep inside the circuits of our phones, I sensed the quiet stirring of something that was not done reaching. The hours that followed blurred into a strange, breathless haze in which every sound in the apartment, every creak of settling wood, every murmur of pipes expanding under the weight of the afternoon heat seemed to carry a faint echo of something more deliberate, as if the building itself were leaning closer to listen. I found myself standing in the center of the living room, phone in hand, though I hadn't consciously picked it up, staring at its black screen with the uneasy certainty that it was not fully dormant, that something behind the glass remained faintly awake, like an eye closed only halfway. I wanted to leave the apartment, to step outside into the world of voices and engines and human noise, but an inexplicable force held me in place. A sense that the moment I crossed the threshold they would follow, the calls would continue, the static would seep into whatever new space I fled to, and there would be no distance wide enough to outrun whatever had decided to tether us. The air was thick, almost syrup-like, when I finally called Mira again, and I had to grip the edge of the dining table because my hands shook so badly. She answered on the first ring, her breath uneven, as if she had been crying or running or both. "Something changed," she whispered before I could speak. "The calls aren't random anymore." I felt the world tilt, not dramatically, but in a subtle, nauseating way, like an elevator shifting half a floor below where it should have stopped. "Tell me exactly what happened," I murmured, though my throat felt tight. Mira inhaled a trembling breath. "I heard him," she said, voice cracking on the final word, not the distorted version, not the echo. It was him, Adrian. It sounded so real I felt my knees go weak. He said my name the way he used to say it when he came home late, soft and tired and trying not to wake me. But then something else, something like static pushed through it, twisting it into something colder, and the line went dead before I could speak. A tremor rippled through me. "Did you say anything back?" "No," she whispered. I was too scared. It sounded like him, but something underneath the voice felt wrong, almost as if someone else was speaking through him, pulling his voice like a thread to shape their own words. I pressed my fingertips to my forehead, trying to steady the swirl of dread thickening inside me. "It's happening to both of us," I said, "and it's getting stronger." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed faintly with the shared realization that we were not simply receiving messages, but being pulled, guided into something that existed beyond our control. Finally, Mira asked the question I had been avoiding. What if they're trying to finish something? Something they weren't done with when they died. The air in my lungs went thin. "You think they're communicating with each other? Through us?" "I don't know what I think," she whispered, "but the calls are aligning. Every time I check my logs, your number and his number appear within seconds of each other, and the last time the static dropped long enough for me to hear anything," he whispered. "Not this line, not this one," like he was searching for another connection. A cold realization crept through my spine like a slow spill of ice water. "Then what are we in this? Just conduits?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth hovered between us like a living thing. I felt it then, the certainty that something was shifting, that whatever had been wandering between frequencies, trying to thread its way through recycled numbers and abandoned IDs, was beginning to find its direction, narrowing its search. The phone in my hand vibrated once, a subtle pulse that felt less like an alert and more like a breath against my palm. I didn't want to look, but the urge was overwhelming, as if the message itself had weight and leaned toward me. When I finally unlocked the screen, a single line of text glowed in the dim room. "Stop interfering. He needs to find her." My grip tightened dangerously. "Mira," I whispered, "I got another message. It's not from your number, not from hers. It's something else." "What does it say?" She breathed. "That we're in the way." Even through the static of distance, I felt her fear radiate through the line. "Adrian," she murmured, "I don't think they're trying to hurt us, but whatever they're trying to reach, wherever they're trying to go, they can't do it unless the connection is clean, unblocked, and we're the ones blocking it." I tried to swallow, but my throat felt sanded raw. So what happens if they push harder? Before she could answer, my phone began to ring again, not with a normal vibration, but with a deep, dragging pulse that felt as though it were vibrating the bones of my hand rather than the casing of the device. The caller ID flashed with a name that shouldn't have existed anymore. Marinette, 1990. My breath stilled. The room around me felt stretched thin, as if reality itself had been pulled tight. "It's her," I whispered. "It's calling again." "Don't answer," Mira said sharply. "We don't know what it wants." The phone continued vibrating in my hand, each pulse slower, heavier, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat trying to sync with mine. And then, in a moment that made my vision blur, Mira's voice wavered through the line. "Adrian, I think my phone is ringing too." I shut my eyes. "Who's calling you?" Her breath shivered audibly. "Your old number." The simultaneous ringing felt choreographed, deliberate, as if something on the other side had finally aligned the signals, finally stabilized whatever fractured corridor it had been searching through, finally found a way to call both of us at once. The air felt charged, humming quietly the way it does right before lightning strikes. "If we answer," I whispered, "we might be opening a door." Mira let out a small, horrified sound. "And if we don't?" I didn't have an answer. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the ringing from my phone stopped, not with a click, not with the automated cutoff of a missed call, but with a soft, drawn-out exhale, as though someone had released the breath they'd been holding while waiting for me to pick up. The message that appeared next was instant, as if it had been cued, waiting for the call to end. "Wrong line, wrong voice, need the other one." I felt the hairs on my arms rise. "They're trying to route through us," I whispered. "They're trying to use us to find the right signal, the right path." "But why us?" Mira's question was fragile, wobbling at the edges. "We didn't ask for this." "Because we took their numbers," I said numbingly. "We took their digital identities. We stepped into the places they left empty." As that truth settled, a faint humming began in the apartment, so low and layered I thought. At first it was an appliance running in another room, but then it shifted, rising in tone, forming chords almost melodic, and I recognized the distorted lullaby again, the one Marisol used to hum absently while working, except now it sounded warped, foreign, as if someone were trying to reconstruct it from memory but kept getting the notes slightly wrong. "Adrian," Mira whispered, her voice breaking. "I can hear something too, but it's not a lullaby. It's him, or a version of him." The voice keeps repeating my name, but each time it sounds further away. I pressed a hand to the wall because the room felt like it was tilting again. "They're converging," I said under my breath. "They're getting closer to whatever they're trying to reach." The hum between us rose once more, then snapped abruptly into silence. So complete, I felt it in my teeth. In that silence, my phone lit up on its own. Not a call, not a message. A shared connection request. An old feature the app had retired years ago, one that allowed two users to temporarily merge call lines to locate the strongest signal between them. The request came from Marinette, 1990, and attached to it was one more line, stark and unadorned. "Let us through." Mira inhaled sharply on the line, the sound thin and terrified. "Adrian, what are we supposed to do?" I stared at the glowing screen, at the ashes of identities resurrecting through broken signals, at a plea that felt less like a message and more like an inevitability. "I don't know," I whispered, "but I think the moment we decide, whatever this is, we'll stop waiting." And as the soft electric hum flickered back to life in the walls around me, I understood with bone-deep certainty that the next decision we made would either close the door forever or open it wider than we were prepared to see. I don't know what exact moment convinced me that answering the request let us through was inevitable, but as I stood in the dim wash of evening light pooling weakly against the apartment walls, listening to the faint and unnatural hum that seemed to shimmer beneath the everyday sounds of the building, I felt as if time itself had narrowed into a single, fragile corridor, one in which every possible choice curved gently, insistently, toward the same destination. My phone rested in my hand like a small, pulsing heart. Mira's voice trembled through the speaker, barely more than a breath, asking if I was still there, asking if I could hear how the static around her had begun to sharpen into tones that almost resembled words, asking if I felt the way she did, that something on the other side had grown impatient, no longer content to search without finding. I told her I was here, that I could hear her clearly, though the truth was that even her voice seemed touched now by the same strange shimmer that wove through the circuits, as if the very act of speaking through a device both of us knew had become compromised was enough to place a veil of otherness over everything it carried. The screen glowed with a soft, steady invitation, as if waiting for a breath to tip the balance. And then, perhaps because silence felt more dangerous than action, I pressed my thumb to the request, allowing knowingly or not a bridge to form. The world did not split open or burst into light. Instead, the change came as a slow, tightening coil of pressure, the kind that rises in the deepest part of the chest when standing on the edge of a precipice whose depth cannot be measured. Mira inhaled sharply on the other end, a small, frightened sound that echoed my own unspoken dread. The phones vibrated once, mine in my hand, hers audible through the faint rattle in her microphone, though neither of us had touched anything else. And then the hum that had lingered like a ghost through the apartment thickened into voices, not clear but layered, overlapping, as though two signals were being forced to converge in a space not designed to hold them. I heard a woman's voice, thin, trembling, stretched as though filtered through grief itself, whisper something that sounded almost like my name, though the syllables were fractured and warped. Mira choked on a sob as another voice, deeper, fragmented by the strange acoustics of whatever place it traveled through, murmured her name with a softness that must have cut her straight to the bone. They were not whole. They were not alive. They were not ghosts, either, at least not in any spiritual sense I had ever believed in. Instead, they felt like echoes, fragments caught in the abandoned halls of recycled numbers, stray electrical imprints that had refused to dissolve, clinging desperately to the pathways along which they had once traveled freely. And now, with both our lines open, they were trying, straining to complete a connection that had been severed by death and rerouted through the living. The phones grew warmer, and for a moment I feared the devices might overheat and die, cutting us off from whatever was unfolding. But the warmth stabilized, pulsed, settled into something that reminded me of a held breath. A single, sharp crackle shot through both lines, and suddenly the voices aligned, the static compressing into a narrow tunnel that carried one simultaneous whisper from both ends. Not this one. Not this one. Not this one. The repetition came like a chant, frantic yet exhausted, as though the speakers, whoever or whatever they had once been, were trying to sift through possibilities, seeking something just beyond the reach of the living. Then, abruptly, the voices changed direction. Other line. Find the other line. I felt the blood drain from my face as a clarity I didn't want settled over me. Mira, I whispered. I think they're not looking for us at all. They're looking for each other. She exhaled shakily, a sound of both terror and dawning comprehension. And where the wrong end points, she murmured, we're blocking the path. Before I could respond, the static surged, not violently, but with a strange, low resonance that made the air in my apartment vibrate. My lights flickered. The hum in the walls rose by a fraction. The temperature shifted by several degrees, not colder or warmer, but different, as though the space around me had momentarily stepped outside itself. And then, louder and clearer than anything I had heard so far, a woman's voice said not to me, but through me, "She's not here." Mira uttered a soft cry. "He isn't either," she whispered. I think they're lost." Something in my chest twisted, a deep ache that had nothing to do with fear. For the first time in months, maybe in a full year, I thought of Marisol not as a memory or a wound, but as a presence that had existed in the world, breathing and laughing and calling my name through a kitchen doorway. I realized then, with a sharp, painful clarity, that whatever fragment of her might have lingered in the digital void had not been calling me. It had been calling someone else, someone who was no longer reachable, someone she had crossed the threshold without. The thought hollowed me out, and in that hollow space, I said something I didn't expect. "What do you need us to do?" The moment the words left me, the static softened, almost tender, as though the act of asking had opened a pathway. A faint tone like a faraway chime rippled through both phones. Then a whisper emerged, clearer than before. "Switch." Mira gasped. "Adrian, they want us to switch lines." The idea struck me as both impossible and inevitable. If Marisol was reaching for Mira's lost partner, and he for her, then our numbers recycled, tangled, misaligned, were acting as barriers rather than conduits. To let them through, we had to cross the lines intentionally, to call each other using the numbers we had abandoned, to open a direct corridor between the paths they were trying to walk. "Are you ready?" I whispered, though I already knew neither of us could ever be ready for something like this. Still, Mira breathed. "Yes." The next moments felt unreal, as though my hands were moving through water rather than air. I opened the dialer, entered my old number, the one I had destroyed, the one that should not exist. When I pressed the green call button, the world seemed to pause just a fraction of a second, just long enough to feel the edges of the moment sharpen. Mira did the same. 2 lines crossing, 2 ghosts waiting. The calls connected, not to each other, no, but to something in between. Something that exhaled through both speakers at once, releasing a sound like a deep, relieved sigh. And then, finally, 2 voices clearer than before, though still stretched thin by the distance between worlds, spoke in unison. "There you are." Mira began to cry. Soft, disbelieving tears. I felt my vision blur. The static around us settled into a soft, distant hum, like ocean waves lapping against a shore neither of us could see. And then, as if satisfied, as if the search had completed its final circuit, the voices whispered one last time, "Goodbye." The lines went silent, entirely, utterly silent. My phone dimmed on its own. The air in the apartment stilled. Mira whispered my name once more, asking if I was still there. I told her yes, but the word felt fragile, as though speaking it risked shattering something delicate that had just been laid to rest. We stayed on the line for a long time, neither of us speaking, neither of us willing to sever the last thread of connection too quickly. Eventually, Mira inhaled shakily. "Do you think it's over?" I looked around the apartment, not at the walls or windows or fading light, but at the spaces that felt suddenly, impossibly quiet. "I think they found what they were looking for," I murmured. "I think they finally reached the right line." Mira let out a soft, trembling sigh. "Then what happens to us now?" I didn't know. I still don't. But as I stood alone in the dim room, listening to the faint hum of a world returning to its ordinary rhythm, a final message appeared on my phone. No sender, no timestamp, just a single line that faded before I could screenshot it. "Thank you for answering." The screen went dark, and somewhere in that darkness, I felt not fear, not relief, but a quiet, lingering presence, like the last trace of a voice slipping gently out of range. The vow of ash. The first thing that struck Victor about the old estate after his father's death was not the silence, though it settled over the corridors like a heavy cloth, thick and suffocating, but the sense that the house itself had grown watchful, as if its walls, long accustomed to bearing witness to the man who ruled it with an iron voice and a cold stare, now regarded Victor with suspicion, wondering whether the new master was worthy or merely an intruder wearing the name of blood. He arrived on the afternoon of the 7th day, the air outside swollen with the weight of midsummer heat, the sky steeped in the color of old brass, and as he stepped onto the gravel path leading toward the manor's arching stone doorway, he felt the crunch under his shoes echo through the courtyard with a hollow resonance that reminded him faintly, disturbingly, of bones shifting under soil. Inside, the air was stale and faintly smoky, not with the warmth of a hearth, but with the stale aftertaste of something burned a long time ago, and though he told himself the place simply hadn't been aired out since the funeral, a faint prickle moved across the back of his neck, urging him to walk more quickly than he normally would. Simon followed behind him, barely making a sound, the small boy's hand limp in Victor's grasp as if his bones had turned soft in the days since the burial. And Victor, who had never known what to do with the child even before grief had stolen the boy's voice, felt acutely the discomfort of being watched by eyes too wide and too silent. Eyes that seemed to see through him in a way no child should ever be capable of. They settled into the manor as dusk seeped into the long windows, turning the cracked wooden floorboards the color of dried blood, and when the servants retreated to their quarters, mumbling half-hearted condolences, the house fell into a quiet so complete that Victor could hear his own heartbeat chiming against his ribs like a distant clock. He busied himself preparing the paper money, folding the thin sheets with a mechanical precision that felt almost soothing, telling himself that this ritual was nothing more than tradition, nothing more than duty, nothing more than a gesture to maintain appearances before the village elders who still held on to old customs about spirits and debts and the lingering tether between the living and the dead. But as he carried the brass bowl out into the courtyard, the night air brushing cool against his face, he could not ignore how the shadows in the windows behind him seemed to gather into the vague outline of a figure his father's height, his father's posture before dissolving when he blinked. Simon stood near the doorway, small and pale in the dim light, his gaze fixed not on the flickering flame. Victor coaxed from the lighter but on the darkness behind him, and Victor, annoyed at the child's disquieting stillness, snapped at him to stand back, though even he heard the thinness of his own voice. When the first sheet of spirit money caught fire, curling slowly into ash, the air shifted. The wind moved as though pushed by a deliberate hand, carrying the burning paper upward in a slow spiral that made Victor's skin crawl, and then one piece, just one, tore loose from the flame, spinning through the air like a golden leaf before drifting, impossibly steadily, into the open doorway of the manor. Simon watched it travel, his expression unreadable, and Victor laughed nervously under his breath, telling himself it was just a trick of the wind, just coincidence, but the sound of that lone sheet of paper settling onto the wooden floor sounded too crisp, too purposeful, like a message arriving. He stepped forward, intending to retrieve it, but Simon moved first, slipping past him with the soft, soundless grace of a shadow. The boy stooped, picked up the half-singed paper, and for a moment Victor thought he might hand it back. But instead, Simon simply stared at it, his eyes reflecting the faint ember glow like two small mirrors in which something older seemed to be smoldering. Then, without hesitation, he held the paper above the thick white fur rug and struck a match he must have taken from the offering table. The flame bloomed instantly, and Victor's shout tore through the quiet as he lunged forward, stomping out the small fire before the rug could catch. The sudden anger rose in him like bile. How many times had he warned the child about playing with fire? But as he grabbed Simon's wrist, ready to scold, ready to shout, he froze, because the boy wasn't looking at him at all. Simon's gaze had shifted toward the far side of the room, where a single wooden chair sat beneath a portrait of Victor's father, and hanging neatly over the back of the chair, as if just left there by someone who intended to return, was a red wool sweater Victor hadn't seen in years, its threads frayed, its color deepened by age into something closer to dried blood. His father's sweater, the one he always wore during winter mornings, the one that had gone missing months before his death. Victor's breath thinned as he stared, unable to recall ever unpacking it, unable to recall seeing it among his father's belongings at all. "Simon," he whispered, not knowing why he felt the need to speak so quietly. "What are you looking at?" But the child did not answer. His lips moved, just barely, like someone whispering to a person standing very close. And in the flickering orange glow of the courtyard flame, the shadow cast by the red sweater stretched unnaturally long across the floor, as though reaching toward the boy in silent recognition. Victor felt a wave of cold rise through him, cutting through the heat of summer, cutting through the thin layer of rationality he always clung to. And for the first time since his father's death, he wondered, truly wondered, whether the old man's presence had ever left this house at all, or whether it still lingered in the places where fire once touched his final breath. He let go of Simon's wrist slowly, stepping back without realizing it, and in the heavy quiet of the room, the flame outside fluttered, then steadied, as though listening. Simon blinked once, his face expressionless, and Victor noticed the faintest tremor in the air, like the moment before a match is struck. The boy's eyes slid from the sweater to Victor's face, and for an instant, a brief, hollow instant, Victor felt as if he were being regarded not by his son, but by someone older, someone who had once worn that sweater and walked these halls with a heavy, deliberate tread. He swallowed hard, unable to speak, and somewhere in the house, a floorboard groaned under a weight that should not have been moving. The night settled deeper around them, the scent of ash lingering in the air like a promise returning home. Victor did not remember falling asleep that night, only the strange heaviness that pulled him downward as he lay on the edge of his father's old bed, a bed too firm, too cold, with a lingering scent of camphor and smoke buried deep in its wooden frame. As his eyes slipped shut, the darkness rose, not like the natural fate of exhaustion, but like a curtain being drawn with deliberate hands, sealing him inside a dream that felt less like imagination and more like memory, returning to reclaim what had been stolen. He found himself standing in the center of the courtyard. The moon overhead seemed wrong, too low, too large, its edges blurred as if seen through heat. The air rippled with warmth that did not belong to the night but to the growing roar of a fire he could feel crawling along the ground like a living thing. When he turned, he saw his father standing several yards away, or rather, the outline of a man shaped like his father. His shoulders were rigid, his head tilted as if listening beyond the crackling flames gathering at his feet. Though the face was half concealed by shifting orange light, Victor recognized the expression instantly. Disdain mixed with weary disappointment, the look his father wore whenever he believed his son was wasting an opportunity. Fire climbed the man's legs slowly at first, licking at the fabric of his trousers as though testing pain, then surged upward in greedy bursts, wrapping his torso in molten ribbons of light. Victor expected a scream, a plea, something human, but the figure only stared at him with dark, glassy eyes that reflected Victor as something smaller, diminished, nearly swallowed by the flames now roaring skyward. The heat struck in heavy waves, carrying the sharp stench of gasoline that scraped Victor's throat raw. He tried to step back, to lift his arms, to close his eyes, but his body would not obey. Pinned to the ground by the dream's will, the flames rose higher, melting the man's features into a grotesque mask of red and black. And just when Victor thought everything would be consumed, the figure opened its mouth and spoke, the voice warped by smoke, stretched thin like heated metal. "You know how this ends," it said, not accusingly, but with a certainty that crushed Victor's chest. Then the fire collapsed inward like a dying star, imploding into darkness that swallowed the courtyard whole. Victor woke with a violent gasp, sweat clinging to his skin. But the true shock, the thing that tore away the last fragments of dream, was the smell flooding the room. Gasoline, thick and nauseating, as if it had been poured directly onto the floor beneath him. His pulse hammered as he stood, the boards creaking, the scent growing stronger with each step. He considered calling for Simon, but a cold instinct warned him to stay silent. The house felt wound tight, holding its breath. At the foot of the stairs, he saw it, a thin, shimmering trail of liquid stretching across the polished floor like a dark vein. He followed it to the living room, where shadows trembled as if alive. The sound broke the stillness, the soft rasp of a match being struck. Victor froze. Simon stood in the center of the room, wearing the red sweater as though it had always belonged to him, its sleeves hanging past his wrists like molten wax. His bare feet stood in a wide pool of gasoline, and in his hand was an old, battered matchbox. His face was empty, his gaze fixed on the cold fireplace. "Simon, what are you doing?" Victor whispered. The boy did not answer. His thumb slid slowly along the edge of the matchbox. Victor stepped forward. The floor groaned. Simon's head turned, not with a child's startled jerk, but with an old, deliberate slowness. The sweater sagged on his shoulders, the shadows behind him stretching into the shape of a man. Victor saw the initials burned into the matchbox as father's. He had thrown it away. The silence thickened. Simon blinked. The sweater shivered. Then the boy spoke. "Everything," the voice rasped, distorted and ancient, "is mine now." The words sliced through Victor with horrifying familiarity. He staggered back, slipping in the gasoline. "Simon, stop," he pleaded. "You're scaring me." "Oh, 4. The thing inside the boy tilted its head, the exact gesture Victor remembered from his father. "Afraid?" the voice croaked. "Do you know how afraid I was, watching you pour gasoline around me like sowing seeds?" Victor shook his head, whispering denial. The boy smiled wrongly, and beneath his feet appeared polished leather shoes, far too large for a child. His father's shoes. Step. The heavy sound echoed through the room. "I know everything," the voice hissed. "Every word you said. Every tremor in your hand when you lit the match. You thought I died instantly." Victor's memories surged gasoline vapors. The barn door. The flame. "Don't," Victor whispered. "You let me burn," the voice said. "Now it's your turn to learn what fire remembers." The matchbox slid open. "Why?" Victor choked. "Because the debt was never paid," the voice replied. "Because the fire never went out. It waited in darkness, in embers, in the eyes of the grandson I loved most." Inshore, the sweater glowed faintly. Simon raised the match. Victor understood then not vengeance, but inheritance. The fire was being passed down. "Stay still," the voice whispered. "Fire knows who it is owed." The match fell. The room bloomed into flame. Victor screamed as fire wrapped around him, his body dissolving into heat and light. Simon stood untouched, the flames parting around him like a throne room. When the house collapsed into ash and sirens wailed, firefighters found Simon sitting calmly outside, the red sweater glowing in the firelight. "Are you hurt?" one asked. Simon looked up, eyes too old. "No," he said softly. "The fire wasn't for me. Where's your father?" Simon glanced back at the burning ruins and smiled a smile belonging to a dead man. "The dead is repaid in fire." "Right?" the ferryman's pact. Nora Whitfield had always believed that rivers carried their own kind of memory. A memory not shaped by time, but by the things the living carelessly surrendered to the water oar strokes that once split the surface, unfinished sentences that slipped between reeds, the final breath of someone who never reached the opposite shore. And maybe it was that belief, fragile and half-formed though it was, that brought her to the Mississippi during the flood season, when the river swelled so wide and high that locals said it had swallowed half the county's soul. She came with her camera case slung across her back, her boots sinking into mud that smelled of iron and deep-rooted things. And as she approached the weather-worn docks of Riverside, she felt the peculiar tightening of the air that seemed to accompany places where the living and the dead shared boundaries too thin for comfort. She had been told, in a hushed half-warning by an elderly woman selling wooden cat figurines at the market, that if she truly wanted to understand the river, she needed to speak to Old Man Calder, though the woman's eyes darted toward the water as if fearing the river might overhear its own name, spoken aloud. Calder, the woman said, was not just a ferryman, he was a keeper of something older, something that moved with the slow patience of silt and current. He rode only after dark, never before moonrise, and kept 2 river mud-glazed cups aboard his boat, one for himself and one for the friend who still traveled with him, though he had died 7 years earlier. That detail had stayed with Nora like the lingering chill of a cold fingertip on her spine. And now, standing on the dim, quivering dock, she wondered whether she'd been foolish to chase a story whispered more like a superstition than an invitation. The river before her looked swollen with secrets, its surface rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths as if something beneath it was shifting in its sleep. She set up her tripod, drew a steadying breath, and scanned the river's dark horizon, and that was when she saw it. A shape emerging not from distance but from darkness itself, a boat sliding forward with no sound other than the faint whisper of water parting under its hull. Old Man Calder sat at its bow, his spine curved like a river-bent cypress branch, the lamplight casting uneven shadows through his wiry gray beard. His hands, knotted and weathered, gripped a long oar that looked older than the dock Nora stood on, and as the boat glided toward her, she felt the same strange sensation one feels when stepping into a room already occupied by a conversation one cannot hear. Calder didn't greet her so much as acknowledge her existence with a single, deliberate nod, the kind of nod that seemed to consult the river first before granting permission. When Nora stepped into the boat, its boards barely creaked. The river accepted her weight with unsettling ease, as though it had expected her. She sat with her equipment on her lap, but her focus drifted almost immediately to the two mud-glazed cups resting between them. One was half-chipped, streaked with whiskey residue. The other was filled to the brim, untouched, its surface shimmering like an unblinking eye. Calder lifted the chipped cup to his lips, took a deep swallow, and then tipped the full one slightly toward the far bank where the fog lay thickest. "For my friend," he muttered, and though his voice was low, Nora felt the words travel the length of the boat like a ripple. Before she could ask anything, a cool wind rushed across the water, dipping into the cup and sending faint, circular ripples across its surface. Nora blinked. The boat wasn't rocking, yet the full cup trembled as if someone had just brushed against it. She steadied her camera, leaning in slightly. "Do you always bring two cups?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Calder didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the shifting dark. "They belong to the boat," he answered. "And the boat belongs to the river. My friend just drinks when the river allows it." As if on cue, the full cup tilted only a hair, but undeniably intentional, a gesture too smooth and too deliberate to attribute to the wind. Nora's breath stalled in her throat. Her fingers trembled around the focus ring of her camera, and she fought the instinct to draw back as Calder finally turned his head, his gaze heavy, river deep, and strangely expectant. "You want the story," he said. "Then listen to the water. It remembers everything." Nora swallowed, nodding, though her eyes were still locked on the cup that refused to sit still. The river around them grew unnervingly quiet. Gone were the frog croaks, the mosquito hum, the rustling of night birds. Nothing remained but the rhythmic dip of Calder's paddle as he pushed the boat into deeper, darker water. The further they drifted, the more Nora felt the river's pulse, a slow, dragging heartbeat that seemed to echo beneath the surface. Calder lifted his cup again but paused before drinking. "His name was Thomas," he said, "studying to be a doctor. Smart kid. Kind. The river took him, or so people say, but not all the way." Nora stiffened. "Not all the way?" Calder nodded. "Some folks drown, but some get stuck between one breath and the next." The oar sliced deeper, then the boat seemed to pick up a current Nora could not see. "Thomas didn't want to take anyone's place," Calder continued, "and that's the only way the river lets you go on your own terms, by pushing someone else under in your stead. But he wouldn't do it." Nora's pulse thudded unevenly. She dared a glance over the edge. Something pale flickered in the water beneath them, too large to be a fish, too slow to be debris. Calder drank, then poured a thin stream from his cup over the side. "They hunt him," he murmured. "The hungry ones. The ones who weren't strong enough to refuse the bargain. They drag at the ankles of anyone who rose alone at night." Nora shivered despite the humid heat pressing against her skin. "And you protect him?" Calder's lips tightened, neither in a smile nor a frown, something heavier. "A promise," he said, "made long ago. Promises don't die just because people do." The river suddenly stilled, as if holding its breath. Nora felt pressure around her ears, like when descending too deep underwater. She steadied herself, gripping the side of the boat. "Calder," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" Because she did something tapping, gently, rhythmically, against the hull from below. 3 slow knocks, then silence. The full cup trembled again, harder this time. Calder finally looked at her, and his eyes were not unkind, but they held something sorrowful, something resigned. "From here on," he said softly, "you must only listen, and whatever you see." He paused. The tapping started again. "Closer. Do not call it by name. Things in the river come quicker when you name them." Nora tried to swallow, but her mouth had gone dry. She lifted her camera, but her fingers were unsteady. Calder returned his gaze to the water, shoulders bowed, as if bracing himself to speak the first chapter of a story the river had been whispering for years. And as the boat slid deeper into the black glass of the Mississippi, Nora felt the suffocating certainty that she had just crossed a threshold not into danger, but into an agreement she didn't remember making. The full cup tilted one final time, and this time, a faint indentation appeared in the whiskey, like the lightest touch of a fingertip breaking the surface. Something unseen had joined them, and the river awake, listening closed behind them as quietly as a door. Nora had expected Old Man Calder's story to come, in fragments, hesitant pieces of memory offered only after enough trust had been built. But instead he began speaking as though the river itself had loosened his tongue, as though some pressure beneath the water had risen to meet them and now demanded a witness. And as his voice unraveled through the damp night air, she felt the boat shift ever so slightly, the current tightening around them like an animal circling to listen. He told her that Thomas had been the kind of young man who believed in fixing things. Not just bodies, but people, a boy who dragged lost dogs home by the dozen, and patched up strangers with the ease of someone who'd been healing long before he'd ever learned the word. It was why everyone believed he would make a doctor with hands that felt like mercy. But mercy, Calder murmured, was a quality the river did not understand. The night Thomas died, the Mississippi had risen 2 feet in an hour, a silent, ravenous swelling that turned the banks into a slick of sucking mud and pulled trees sideways like matchsticks. Thomas had gone down to check on a family living in a houseboat, ignoring warnings about floating debris. Because, Calder said, he had that peculiar type of goodness that made him blind to danger when someone else might suffer. The river swept him under so fast that even those on shore thought he had simply vanished, though one woman swore she heard him cry out not for help, but for someone else, a sound cut short by the sudden, brutal silence of deep water. Nora listened, the hair rising on her arms, because Calder wasn't telling this like a tragedy people retell over beer. He spoke like someone describing a drowning that was still happening, again and again, replaying under the surface every night since. But Thomas didn't cross, Calder said quietly, pausing to dip his hand into the river, letting water sheet across his fingers as though greeting an old friend. He stayed, not because he wanted to, but because the river held him. Nora frowned, leaning forward despite herself. Held him how? It was a foolish question. She knew it the moment she asked, because Calder's eyes shifted toward her with something between pity and warning. Rivers don't just carry the dead, he said. Sometimes they keep them. Sometimes they feed on their longing. You ever seen a body trapped under a log jam? It floats, sinks, floats again, caught in a space between moving and stopping. Thomas ended up like that, only without the body. Nora shuddered. The water looked so deceptively calm, its surface matte black, holding only the faint reflection of the moon. Calder continued, explaining that when Thomas realized he wasn't leaving, he also realized something else. The Mississippi was full of others who had died without accepting it, people who had fought the current, begged for breath, clawed at the water, unable to cross because they refused the price of release. The river don't take you clean, Calder murmured. It takes you in pieces. First your breath, then your fear, then your voice, and last, your name. Nora felt the words sink into her stomach like stones. What about the hungry ones? She asked, recalling his earlier warning. Calder's grip tightened on the oar. They come after those who resist, he said. Folks who drowned angry, who felt cheated. They aren't whole anymore, just mouths and memories, clinging to the cold. They drag at ankles, pull on ropes, bang on hulls, hoping to find someone to trade places with. They think if they can push someone under, they'll get to leave. Nora's breath hitched, but Thomas didn't try to replace anyone. Calder shook his head. Thomas wouldn't take another life to buy back his own. He thought that made him noble, but the river doesn't respect noble. It respects balance. Everything drowned has to be accounted for. The boat slowed, as if the water had thickened beneath them. Nora leaned over the edge and saw shapes, faint, pale suggestions of hands or faces drifting below, rising for moments before dissolving into the dark. Her heart hammered painfully. "Do you see them too?" she whispered. Calder didn't answer immediately. Instead, He poured a thin line of whiskey from his chipped cup into the river, and Nora watched the liquid spread like an offering, glowing faintly before vanishing. "I see more than I should," he said, voice barely above a breath. "Thomas shows me. He tries to keep them off my boat." Nora felt an unexpected spike of fear. "Why you?" Calder gave a tired smile. "Because I was with him the night he drowned. Because he called my name before the water closed. Some bonds don't end just because the body quits breathing." Nora studied him, noticing the way his shoulders sagged, as though carrying more than age. "You've been protecting him for 7 years?" she asked softly. Calder nodded, eyes distant. "Every night the river rises. Every night they come for him. And every night he pushes them back so they don't climb aboard. Some nights he's strong. Some nights, less so. That's why I row only after dark. It's when he needs help." Nora sensed something shifting behind them. A ripple, a current, a stirring of unseen things. She turned, but the water lay still, glossy as obsidian. "What happens if he can't hold them back someday?" she whispered. Calder's face darkened, creased with a grief too old to be fresh. "Then he becomes one of them. The hungry. And the river never forgets a hungry ghost." Nora opened her mouth to respond, but a sudden knock, sharp, hollow, hit the underside of the boat, rattling the boards beneath her feet. She jolted, clutching the bench. Another knock followed, then another 3 quick taps, like someone signaling from below. Calder didn't flinch. "Don't answer," he murmured. Nora didn't understand what he meant by answer until something else surfaced, a whisper, thin as mist, brushing against her left ear with the unmistakable cadence of a human breath. "Help." Nora froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the river. It was a voice, a young man's voice, trembling and waterlogged. Calder immediately dropped a hand to her shoulder, grounding her. "Don't speak back," he warned, his grip firm. "If you acknowledge them, they'll know you can hear. They'll follow you home." Nora swallowed hard, fighting the instinct to respond, to assure the voice that she wasn't ignoring it. Her chest tightened. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the water. Silence stretched thin between them until Calder finally spoke again. "Thomas isn't the one asking," he said quietly. "He never begs. Not anymore." Nora's breath trembled. "Then who?" She didn't finish the sentence, because the answer bubbled up from beneath the hull, a dark shape rising too quickly, too silently, the faint outline of fingers brushing the underside of the surface before slipping back into the deep. Nora clamped her hand over her mouth, trying not to scream. The boat rocked gently, as though something large had passed beneath it. Calder steadied the oar and continued rowing, but his expression grew increasingly strained. "They're restless tonight," he muttered. "The flood wakes all the old ones. They smell movement. They smell choices being made." Nora's head snapped toward him. "Choices?" Calder hesitated for the first time. "Thomas can't linger forever," he said. "He's held on longer than any soul I've seen, but the river's balance is tipping. Something's shifting. He feels it. I feel it. Even the hungry feel it. Shifting. How?" Nora asked, but Calder didn't respond. Instead, he looked toward the far bank, where a line of mist was beginning to glow, not white, not silver, but a faint sickle of blue-green, as if the river were drawing a breath of phosphorescent light from its depths. The glow curved toward them, bending like a beckoning finger. Calder's knuckles whitened on the oar. "We're close," he whispered. "Though to what?" Nora didn't dare ask. The tapping returned first soft, then forceful, a frantic rhythm demanding entry. The full cup trembled once more, vibrating against the wooden floorboards, then stilled suddenly, as if a hand had tightened around it. The river beneath them quieted into an unnatural stillness, so silent Nora imagined she could hear the heartbeat of the man whose name she had not yet spoken aloud. Thomas. The boat drifted forward, unpowered now, sliding as though drawn by an unseen current toward the shimmering bank of mist. Calder's voice dropped to a rasp. "From here on, remember what I tell you. The dead who want to be found will find you, and the dead who don't He paused. Behind them, something broke the surface of the river with a soft, sucking gasp. "We'll follow anyway." Nora gripped her camera like a talisman, though she doubted plastic and metal meant anything to ancient river ghosts. Calder lifted his cup again, drinking deeply, then poured another offering into the water. This time, the river didn't swallow it immediately. The whiskey hovered on the surface, glowing faintly, then began to sink slowly, deliberately spiraling downward as though drawn by hands waiting below. Nora watched it disappear, feeling colder with every second. Calder exhaled, long and slow. "Thomas is coming," he said. And the river, as if obeying a cue, breathed out a low, mournful sound that made Nora's bones ache. Nora felt the river changing around them before she fully understood what she was seeing, a subtle tightening in the air like the shift in pressure before a storm, except this pressure didn't come from above but from below, rising through the boat's wooden spine in a slow vibration that traveled into her legs and settled behind her ribs, making every breath feel borrowed. And as Old Man Calder steered them deeper into the glowing mist gathering along the water, she sensed that whatever approached was not a ghost in the traditional sense, not the cold, disembodied wail of lost folklore, but something rooted in the river itself, something shaped by mud and memory and years of waiting, something that responded not to light or shadow but to the weight of promises never broken. The river current began carrying them without Calder's oar, although he still held it, blade hovering just above the surface, as if touching the water now might offend whatever presence was rising. The mist thickened until Nora felt wetness bead on her eyelashes, each drop tasting faintly of salt and dirt when it slid down her cheek. The faint blue-green glow she had glimpsed earlier now pulsed beneath the water in slow, rhythmic bursts, like the beating heart of a submerged creature she could not see. And every time the pulse brightened, the tapping under the hull returned 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more, as though something was trying to remind them of its presence, or its hunger, or its right to be heard. Nora tried to steady her breathing, but the air grew colder with each pulse, and she found herself leaning closer to Calder, as though proximity to another living body might anchor her to the world she understood. Calder, however, seemed to be drifting somewhere between present and past. His eyes glistened with unspoken grief as he murmured into the night, "I've felt him near before, but never like this. He's stronger tonight. The river must be letting him rise." Nora swallowed, tasting the metallic tang of fear. "Why now?" she whispered, though part of her wished she had stayed silent, because words on the river felt like invitations, and invitations felt dangerous. Calder didn't look at her. "Because things are shifting," he said. "Because he's close to choosing, and because the hungry ones are close to forcing him." Nora opened her mouth to ask what choosing meant, but the question died when something brushed the side of the boat, a long, gliding touch that didn't scrape so much as stroke, as if testing the vessel's strength. The lantern's flame flickered violently, casting broken shadows that made Calder's face look carved from driftwood, deep-set eyes hollowed by moonless years. Nora clutched her camera tighter, though recording suddenly felt invasive, like shining a light into the face of something sacred. Then, without warning, the river went still, completely still. The mist ceased its drifting. The water beneath them flattened into a flawless mirror, reflecting the faint glow from somewhere deep below. Nora felt her heartbeat thud in her throat. Calder inhaled sharply. "He's coming up," he murmured, voice cracking with the weight of something between hope and dread. "Stay still, girl. Don't lean. Don't speak. He needs to see you're not a threat." Nora nodded, even though she doubted she could move if she wanted to. Her limbs felt coated in wet clay, heavy and half fossilized. A shape began rising from the depths, not swiftly, not with the splashy violence of something physical, but with a slow, drifting inevitability, like silt carried upward on a current too ancient to resist. At first, it looked like a single wisp of gold, shimmering faintly in the dark water. Then, another wisp joined it, and another, until a cluster of golden threads floated up in a loose column. The glow intensified, swirling into the vague outline of a human figure, shoulders, neck, head, made entirely of soft, pulsing light, as if hundreds of fireflies had gathered and agreed upon a single shape. Nora's breath caught. She had expected something terrifying, some drowned visage with empty eye sockets, some bloated specter of folklore, but instead, the figure rising from the river radiated a gentle sorrow that felt older than the tide. Calder bowed his head, murmuring, "Thomas, boy, I'm here." The light shape trembled softly, as though acknowledging his voice, and drifted closer to the surface until it hovered inches above the water. Its edges warbled like the reflection of a candle in a glass jar, and though it had no eyes, Nora had the uncanny sensation that it was staring directly at her, looking through her, as though measuring the weight of her presence on this boat. She felt the urge to apologize for existing. When Calder reached a trembling hand toward the glowing figure, the light rippled outward, as though startled or uncertain. "Easy now," Calder whispered, voice shaking. "I brought the cup. I kept the promise." At the mention of the cup, the light stilled and then dipped, slowly, toward the second mud-glazed vessel resting on the boat floor. Nora watched in stunned disbelief as the surface of the whiskey within the cup began to swirl, forming delicate concentric rings, though nothing touched it. A faint hum filled the air, low and resonant, vibrating in her bones more than in her ears. Thomas, if this truly was Thomas, was interacting with the offering. Calder's mouth trembled into the hint of a smile. "He remembers," he whispered. "After all this time, he still remembers." But the moment of peace fractured as another sound rose, something soft and distant at first, like wind moving through underwater reeds, but quickly sharpening into a wet, slapping rhythm that made Nora's stomach twist. Calder's expression collapsed into dread. "They're here," he hissed. "The hungry ones." They followed him. Nora turned sharply toward the river, and that was when she saw them, not fully, not clearly, but in reflections along the black surface. Pale shapes glided just beneath the water, dozens of them, maybe more, forming a loose ring around the boat. The mist recoiled from their presence, retreating like breath sucked backward. One shape rose enough for Nora to glimpse the curve of a face that looked almost human until the mouth appeared far too wide, stretching unnaturally, as though it had been torn open by water pressure or by the soul's final, desperate gasp. The figure slipped beneath the surface again, leaving Nora trembling violently. The light that was Thomas flickered, shrinking back toward the center of the boat as though trying to protect itself. Calder's oar lifted, not in defense, but in plea. "Leave him," he whispered to the water. "Leave him be. He ain't yours." The river responded with a sound Nora had never heard before, a deep, rumbling groan that felt like the entire body of water was exhaling in irritation. The boat rocked. The glowing mist around them dimmed as if pulled backward by invisible fingers. Then came the tapping, furious now, pounding from all sides, rattling the hull, frantic and hungry. Nora clamped her hands over her ears, sucking in panicked breaths, but Calder grabbed her wrist. "Look at him," he ordered. "Look at Thomas. Don't look at them. Don't let them think you're listening." Nora forced herself to keep her eyes on the golden figure, though its outline shook violently, as if the hungry ones sought to unravel it. The whiskey in the full cup sloshed over the rim, spilling across the boards. Thomas dimmed another shade. Calder's breath broke. "Hold on, boy," he pleaded. "Hold on. Don't let them take you." But the pounding intensified, growing into a cacophony that reverberated through Nora's spine. The water around them erupted in strange ripples, circles overlapping in chaotic spirals as pale shapes collided beneath the surface. Then one of the shapes broke the water, an arm swollen beyond natural size, mottled blue-black, reaching upward with fingers that seemed to bend at wrong angles. Nora recoiled, barely stifling a scream. Calder drew her closer, pressing her away from the reach of the ghostly limb. Thomas's glow faltered again, his form thinning like a candle guttering in wind. "They're trying to force him to take someone," Calder whispered hoarsely. "Anyone. They don't care who." Nora's heart plummeted as the implication struck her. Her. The hungry ones wanted Thomas to choose her, to take her place. Cold dread seeped into her bones. Calder saw the realization forming in her eyes and shook his head violently. "Don't fear him," he whispered. "Fear them. Thomas would never harm you. He's resisted them for 7 years." But his voice broke as he added, "I just don't know if he can hold them off tonight." As if in response, the glowing figure drifted closer to Calder, trembling violently, and for the first time it produced a sound soft, fragile, aching, a whisper shaped like wind through reeds, a single word, "Please." Calder's face contorted in anguish. "I know, boy," he whispered. "I know." And then the river glowed brighter, 3 distinct points of light flickering beneath the surface, circling rapidly. Nora didn't know what they were yet, but Calder stiffened in recognition, and she realized with dawning terror that the river was not just reacting, it was choosing, and whatever choice it made was coming for them. Nora did not immediately understand what the 3 flickering lights beneath the water meant, but Calder's expression changed with such violent clarity, fear, resignation, an ancient kind of resolve that she felt the air compress around them as though the river had suddenly lowered its ceiling. He set the oar down with deliberate gentleness, as if acknowledging that rowing no longer mattered, that the boat was no longer his to steer. And then he reached for the small clay jug wedged between 2 ribs of the hull, the jug she'd assumed merely held more whiskey, but which he lifted with a reverence that suggested something far heavier than alcohol rested inside. The hungry ones continued to slam themselves against the boat, their knocks becoming so frenzied and overlapping that the hull vibrated as though caught in a storm, yet the water's surface remained mirror flat, an impossible contradiction that made Nora's skin prickle in warning. The Thomas light flickered erratically, shrinking and stretching, pulled taut by unseen hands like a sheet caught in a violent tide. Calder looked at the trembling golden silhouette with an expression that Nora had not seen on him before. Something like a father's grief mixed with a priest's grim duty, and he whispered, "It's all right, boy. You've held on long enough. It's time for me to take the place I should have taken from the start." Nora's head whipped toward him, confusion slicing through her fear. Take the place, what does that mean? But Calder only offered her a sad, near-silent smile as he uncorked the jug, releasing a smell Nora couldn't immediately identify, sweet, sharp, earthy, almost metallic, like wine fermenting in mud. It coated the air with an unsettling heaviness. Calder poured the liquid over his coat, letting it run down his sleeves, soaking into the fabric with the slow absorption of something unnervingly organic. Nora realized with a jolt that it wasn't whiskey. It was too thick, too dark, seeping like ink rather than spilling like water. "Calder, what are you doing?" she demanded, voice cracking. The old man kept his gaze fixed on Thomas, ignoring the hungry things trying to breach the hull. "He wasn't supposed to be the one stuck," he murmured. "He wasn't supposed to guard the crossings alone. The river chose him because I failed. I should have saved him that night, but the flood pulled faster than my hands could hold. And when I begged the river to let him go, it offered a bargain when I turned down because I was a coward who still wanted the life waiting on shore." Nora shook her head, refusing to believe what she was hearing. "A bargain? You're talking like the river is alive." Calder let out a brittle laugh, humorless and raw. "Girl, the river was alive long before any of us started naming it. Names don't give a thing life, they just give a direction." Then he struck a match. Nora gasped as flame bloomed in his palm, soft at first, like a candle wick, but then rising, spreading along his mud-soaked coat, climbing his arms in ribbons of orange and blue. She cried out in horror, scrambling toward him, but Calder raised a hand to stop her, not in pain but in reassurance. The flames did not devour him. They danced across his skin as if greeting something they had long been denied, illuminating the lines in his face, casting him in a surreal, reverent glow. "Don't," he said calmly. "This isn't fire to harm. This is fire to reveal." Nora stared, trembling, unable to reconcile what she saw. The man was engulfed, yet the flames curled around him affectionately, licking at his flesh without leaving so much as a scorch. The river around the boat hissed not with steam but with agitation, as though the hungry ones sensed a ritual they had no power to influence. The Thomas light surged upward, its form struggling to remain coherent. Flickering violently like a lantern battling the wind, Calder stepped toward it, the flames casting long shards of gold across the water. "You held them off for 7 years, boy," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. 7 years you fought not to take a living breath for your own release. You honored your name even after the river took it from you. The golden outline trembled. Leaning toward him like a wounded animal seeking shelter, Nora felt tears sting her eyes, though she didn't know why. Grief for Calder, grief for Thomas, or grief for the strange, impossible tenderness between them. Calder continued, voice soft. The pact couldn't hold forever. Something had to give. And the river never lets a debt go unpaid. Nora swallowed hard. "Calder, please tell me what you're doing." At last he turned to her, and in the flickering firelight, his eyes reflected both the living world and something far older. "A ferryman doesn't just guide souls," he said. "He protects them, keeps balance, makes sure the hungry ones don't take what's not theirs. Thomas wasn't meant to bear that burden alone. I was supposed to take the role. I promised him, promised on the night he died, that if the river ever came knocking for him, I'd answer in his place." Another impact rattled the hull, a hard one this time, followed by a wailing sound so cold it felt like winter climbing up Nora's spine. The hungry ones were circling faster, glimpses of their pale faces rising momentarily before sinking again, jaws opening too wide, eyes empty except for the frantic, starving recognition of the living. Calder ignored them. "It's time the river collected on its bargain," he said. "And tonight, the crossings change hands." Then he stepped forward into the Thomas light, and the moment their forms touched fire, meeting luminescence, the river erupted in sound, a deep, resonant boom like a submerged bell. The entire surface rippled outward in enormous concentric waves, and the hungry ones recoiled instantly, their grayish forms dragged backward by an unseen force. Thomas's light expanded, brightened, wrapped around Calder like a second skin, trembling with relief, grief, love. Nora couldn't tell. The temperature around the boat shifted again, a warmth blooming through the air that felt almost like sunlight. Though they were deep inside a moon-stained night, Calder closed his eyes, breathing deeply as Thomas's golden glow began to sink toward the river, pulling Calder inexorably with it. Nora lurched forward, heart pounding. "Calder!" But the old man lifted a calming hand, flames receding from his body as though evaporating into the mist. "Don't mourn me, girl," he said gently. "I'm not dying. I'm trading places." Thomas drifted downward, drawing Calder with him. The hungry ones wailed, frustrated, thwarted as if the shift in roles robbed them of a prey they had waited years to claim. "Listen to me, Nora Whitfield," Calder said, his voice growing fainter as the golden glow deepened. "There's rules to this river, old ones. Only a ferryman can hold the crossings. Only a ferryman can keep the hungry away. And Thomas, he's fought too long for something that wasn't meant to be his." Water lapped the sides of the boat, glowing faintly in response. Nora felt heat behind her eyes, panic clawing at her throat. "Calder, you don't have to do this. There has to be another." "No," he interrupted softly. "This is the end of the promise. The river knows its keeper now." Thomas touched Calder's chest, just a luminous hand. Trembling, and the flames on Calder's coat vanished in an instant, extinguished without smoke, without ember, as if the two energies recognized one another and agreed upon a truce. "Take care of the boat," Calder whispered to Thomas, "and keep your name. Don't let the river have that too." Nora's breath hitched as the two figures, one golden, one fading into the glow, descended into the dark, slipping beneath the water with the gentle inevitability of a stone returning to earth. And as Calder disappeared completely, 3 blue-green lights rose in his place, glowing like river will-o-wisps, swirling slowly above the surface in a pattern that felt ritualistic, ancient, and heartbreakingly final. The pact was sealed. The ferryman had been chosen. The boat shuddered as though exhaling its acceptance, and from somewhere deep in the water, Nora heard a thin, trembling voice, not Calder's, not Thomas's, but something between the two whisper, "It's done." For a long moment after old man Calder slipped beneath the surface, Nora could only stare at the widening rings that spread outward across the water, trembling in the dark like the soft fading note of a song not meant for human ears. And in that silence, heavy, quivering, absolute, she felt the river hold its breath, as though recognizing the gravity of a life willingly surrendered. The boat rocked once, then stilled as if anchored by a hand she could not see. And when she reached instinctively toward the edge, the boards beneath her palm felt warmer than they should have in the night air, pulsing faintly like muscle rather than wood. The 3 blue-green orbs floating where Calder had vanished drifted upward in a slow spiral, casting long, wavering reflections across the water, and Nora found herself unable to look away from them, mesmerized by the strange balance of sorrow and beauty that radiated through their glow. The hungry ones, who only moments before had clawed with desperation at the hull, now hovered deeper in the water, their forms slipping away from the light, as if repelled by the very energy that held the orbs aloft. The Thomas light pulsed weakly, as though recovering from the ordeal, and Nora realized for the first time that the golden figure was no longer trembling with panic or pain. Instead, it drifted with an unexpected steadiness, rising until it hovered at eye level with her, its shape clearer now, shoulders squarer, chest broader, the outline of a young man materializing in shimmering fragments like a memory coming into focus. Nora watched, chest tight, as the luminous form took a step, if it could be called that, toward where Calder had disappeared, and something in her instinctively reached out, not to stop Thomas, but to acknowledge him, to confirm that she had witnessed what the world would never believe. The golden figure paused, light flickering as if considering the gesture. Then a faint ripple of warmth moved through the air and brushed her hand, a sensation so gentle, yet unmistakably deliberate that tears pricked her eyes. The river stirred again, but differently now, with a softness she had not felt before, a tender undulation like a sigh of gratitude or grief. The 3 blue-green lights dipped low in unison, hovering just above the surface where Calder had gone under, and then slowly they began to sink, drifting back into the depths like lanterns returning to their sockets. As they descended, the hungry ones retreated further into the dark, their pale outlines dissolving into the current, and Nora could swear she heard faint whispers of disappointment, as though they mourned the loss of a prize they had almost claimed. The Thomas light shifted toward her once more, and then, impossibly, a voice emerged, not the distorted, waterlogged whisper she'd heard earlier, but a clear, gentle tone, warm and melodic, the voice of someone who might have once asked questions in a lecture hall or laughed at a friend's joke. "He saved me," Thomas said, the sound weaving itself into the night air with a fragile clarity. Nora swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "Calder?" Thomas brightened slightly, as though nodding. "I waited too long. I should have left. But he stayed with me, kept the others away, held my name in the world." Nora wiped a trembling hand across her cheek. He traded places with you." For a moment the golden figure dimmed, flickering like a candle disturbed by breath. "No," Thomas murmured. "He took the place that belonged to him all along." The simplicity of that truth hit Nora with the weight of a stone dropped into water. Sudden, heavy, spreading out in ripples that touched every assumption she'd made about the man. She had thought Calder eccentric, strange, perhaps even delusional at times, but never once had she imagined him carrying the burden meant for another, keeping vigil over a dead friend not out of obligation but out of love shaped by guilt. Thomas drifted closer until the glow enveloped the boat's railing. "The river always keeps balance," he said. "Someone must guard the crossing. Someone must hold the hungry ones away." Nora's voice trembled. "And now Calder." Thomas finished the sentence with a quiet finality. "He is the ferryman." The words hung in the air like a benediction, echoing faintly through the mist. A new stillness settled over the Mississippi, a stillness that felt strangely protective, as though the river accepted its new keeper and sought to calm itself around him. Nora gazed at the water, imagining Calder descending into a place where daylight never touched, imagining him stepping into a role older than any folklore she'd heard, imagining him greeting the lonely, lost souls with the same gruff gentleness he'd shown Thomas. Her chest ached with a grief so raw it surprised her. Thomas spoke again, softer now, as though the words cost him something to say. "He saved me twice," he murmured. "Once when I died. Once when I couldn't leave." Nora's breath shuddered. "Then, are you free?" For the first time, the golden light shimmered with unmistakable joy. "Yes," he said simply. "I can cross." Something inside Nora released a tension she hadn't realized had taken root. She found herself whispering, almost against her will, "Then why are you still here?" Thomas hovered closer, his glow extending toward the second mud-glazed cup, the one Calder had always kept full. The whiskey inside no longer trembled. It lay still and reflective as a calm eye. "To give you a message," Thomas said, "so you remember him, so you honor the promise he made." Nora's breath caught again, the night thickening around her as though bracing for the weight of what would follow. Thomas's form drifted toward her, the glow warming her skin like the last rays of a setting sun. "If you ever want to see him again," he said, "bring whiskey in a mud-glazed cup to the water. He won't come above it, but he'll hear you." Nora felt something deep within her tremble, a mixture of awe and terror. "Will he answer?" she asked. Thomas dimmed a little, as if considering. "He will come close," he said, "closer than you think." Nora nodded, though she wasn't sure her body was capable of anything else. The golden figure lingered, luminous and gentle, a presence almost unbearably kind in its sorrow. Then he turned, or rather, pivoted in a way that felt organic despite lacking a body, and drifted backward toward the mist. The river's glow shifted, opening a path before him like curtains parting on an ancient stage. As Thomas moved into the shimmering passage, his light began to unravel, strands peeling away like fireflies dispersing into summer dusk. "Goodbye, Nora Whitfield," he whispered. "Tell the river he kept his promise." The last filament of light winked out. The mist swallowed the echo of his words, and the river fell silent, truly silent in a way Nora had not felt since stepping into Calder's boat. She sat there for what felt like hours, though the moon had barely shifted in the sky, her hands pressed against the planks, absorbing the faint warmth that still lingered from the fire that had not burned, the pact that had been sealed. Eventually, she forced herself upright. The boat no longer drifted. It sat perfectly still on the unnaturally calm water, as if moored to an invisible post. Nora reached for the oar more out of desperation than skill and dipped it into the river. This time, the Mississippi accepted her movement, nudging her gently toward the shoreline. By the time her boots touched the muddy bank, dawn had begun to stain the horizon with weak, uncertain light. She turned back once, meaning to memorize the boat, the lantern, the empty cups, proof that everything she'd witnessed had truly happened. But the boat was gone, not drifting downriver, not submerged, simply gone, like something summoned only for the duration of a story that had finally reached its ending. Nora felt the wind shift against her cheek, carrying the faint scent of whiskey and river mud. She didn't look back a second time. She just ran until the trees swallowed her, until the river's voice faded behind her, until the world felt mundane enough for daylight to hold. But even as she reached the road, even as the sun touched her back, she heard it faint, rhythmic, unmistakable, the sound of a single oar dipping into water, far out in the mist, slow, steady, and meant for someone who wasn't her. The stone carvers told Mr. Silas Withrow had always believed the mountains kept their own score of the living and the dead, that every man who worked the stone along the ridges of the Appalachians owed something to the earth he carved, no matter how many years he spent pretending otherwise. And perhaps that was why the night he staggered home from the quarry, boots dusted white, breath sweet with corn whiskey, shoulders aching with the heaviness of a life, spent chiseling names he would never meet, felt different from all the other nights. He had crossed the old stone bridge that arched like a broken spine over Coldwater Gorge. The air held a peculiar bite, a cold too sharp for late autumn, the kind that seemed to slip beneath a man's coat and remind him he was only flesh. Nothing more durable than the chisels he was always breaking. Silas blinked against the wind, suddenly lucid, the alcohol retreating from his skull as though frightened off by something older waiting in the dark. He steadied himself with a gloved hand on the bridge's railing, fingers brushing the weathered grooves in the stone grooves he had always thought came from the river below, though tonight he swore they felt like fingerprints pressing upward from inside the rock. He shivered, adjusting his hat, and continued across the bridge, boots crunching against grit, when he noticed a man walking beside him. No footsteps, announcing his arrival. No voice greeting him, just a tall figure in a dark coat that glimmered strangely in the moonlight, as though dusted with powdered mica. Silas had lived his whole life in the mountains, and knew the folk well enough to recognize everyone for 20 miles around. Yet, he did not know this stranger, not by face nor by gait, and the unfamiliarity stirred a quiet throb of unease. Still, whiskey loosened his tongue more than it sharpened his fear. "Evening, friend," Silas muttered, trying to sound casual though his voice quivered. The stranger smiled, thin, polite, unfathomable. "Evening, mister." "Withrow," the man replied, and Silas froze mid-step, the sound of his own name drifting across the gorge like a leaf caught in a windless fall. The stranger should not have known him, yet he spoke with the easy certainty of someone greeting an old companion. "Long day for you," the man added conversationally. "Mortal hands grow tired quicker than they used to." Silas frowned, scrubbing a palm across his beard. "You're talking mighty strange for a man I ain't been introduced to." The stranger only smiled wider. "Names don't matter here, only the count." Silas blinked in confusion. "The count? Your household," the stranger said pleasantly, as though asking about the weather. "How many people live under your roof, mister? Withrow? And count properly. Now don't forget to include the living." The question slid into Silas's ears like a draft of cold water. "The livin'?" he repeated. "Ain't that what I be countin'?" The stranger chuckled softly, and the sound carried a hollow resonance, like laughter echoing inside a cavern. "Not everyone remembers to separate them. Some households keep company they no longer see. Some men carve grave markers for the dead without realizing the dead have followed them home." Silas tried to keep walking, but the bridge beneath him felt suddenly longer, as though stretching itself like taffy, refusing to let him reach the other side. "Look here," Silas muttered nervously. "I don't mean to be rude, but I ain't in the mood for riddles." The stranger tilted his head with an unsettling grace. "Not riddles," he said softly. "Declarations." Silas felt his heartbeat thud unevenly against his ribs. "Declarations about what?" The stranger stopped walking then, and though Silas took 2 more steps before realizing he was alone on the bridge, the stranger's presence felt impossibly close, as though he occupied the air itself rather than the stone behind him. Silas turned slowly. The man in the coat was standing perfectly still, hands folded neatly behind his back, and in the moonlight his face seemed too smooth, too polished, like marble warmed only by the idea of a man rather than blood. "I come from below," the stranger said simply, "and I was sent to take the count." Silas wanted to laugh, to dismiss the words as mountain superstition or the ramblings of a drifter, but the air around them had grown dense, heavy with a pressure that made his lungs work harder to draw breath. "Below?" Silas repeated weakly, though he already knew he didn't want the answer. The stranger raised 2 fingers to his own collarbone, and then, with a movement so casual it bordered on obscene, he unlatched his head. Not pulled it, not twisted it, unlatched it, as though removing a hat or unbuttoning a coat's top button. The head came free with a faint, damp pop. Silas didn't scream at first. He was too stunned to make sound, too horrified to decide whether to run or fall to his knees. The stranger's body stood calmly, holding its own head in both hands, and the head blinked twice, adjusting to its new vantage point. "You see," the head said cheerfully, as though they were sharing a parlor trick. "Proof is a courtesy after all." Silas staggered backward, nearly slipping off the bridge. His voice broke. "Sweet Lord, not his jurisdiction tonight," the head interrupted pleasantly. Then the body tossed the head upward, juggling it with an expert's precision. Up, catch. Down, toss. Up again, catch. The motion was impossibly smooth, impossibly playful, and impossibly wrong. Silas found his scream, then a raw, animal sound torn from a throat unused to such panic, and he turned, bolting across the bridge. His boots hammered against the stone, but the rhythm of pursuit behind him was worse. Two distinct patterns: the rapid thump of the stranger's running steps and the softer, horrifying patter of the head bouncing off the stranger's palms as he chased Silas with unhurried delight. "No need to flee, Mr. Withrow," the head called, its voice rotating in the air like a thrown echo. "I only need the count." Silas did not look back. He ran until the world blurred into streaks of darkness and moonlight, until the bridge gave way to the dirt road leading toward town. His lungs burned, but terror drove him forward. When he heard wheels creaking in the distance, he nearly sobbed with relief. A wagon passing by at this time of night. Silas threw himself into the road, waving frantically. A horse snorted, hooves sliding in the dust, and the wagon lurched to a stop. "Help!" Silas wheezed. "God help me, let me on." The driver, an elderly man in a straw hat with a jaw as square as the stone Silas carved, squinted down at him. "Easy now," the driver said. "Ain't no harm riding with me. Climb on." Silas scrambled into the wagon bed, panting, shaking, and only when he collapsed against the wooden crates did he notice something deeply wrong. The texture of the planks was too soft, too pliable, giving slightly under his weight like damp paper rather than dry timber. Silas blinked, confused, but before he could investigate further, the driver spoke again, a voice perfectly calm. "Best sit gentle. Don't want to tear it." Silas looked up, bewildered. "Tear? What?" "The wagon," the man said. "It's made of paper." Silas stared at him, certain he'd misheard, but then the driver turned fully toward him, and Silas saw that the man had not one face, but two, one facing forward, weathered and smiling thinly, and another face, identical in every feature, facing backward, watching Silas with unblinking intensity. Both faces grinned. Silas let out a broken shriek and scrambled backward, but his heel punched through the wagon's floorboard with a sickening tear like ripping parchment. The entire bed of the wagon sagged. The backward-facing mouth clicked its tongue. "Now look what you've done," it said. "Paper don't grow on trees, you know." Silas's bladder gave out. Warm humiliation spread down his leg. And the moment the first drop hit the floor, the entire wagon dissolved, peeling, collapsing, curling into wet wads of pulp. Silas tumbled into the mud, gasping, and the two-faced man stepped calmly down from the collapsing remnants. "You broke my wagon," he said mildly. "That'll need settling." Silas scrambled away, sobbing, until his back hit something solid, a massive boulder beside the road he'd passed 1,000 times. Tonight the stone radiated heat, or presence, or something ancient that made Silas fall to his knees. He pressed his forehead to the rough surface, babbling prayers he hadn't spoken since childhood. "Please," he begged, "please. God or whoever's listening, spare me, please." The two-faced man stopped behind him. Silence stretched. Then, from deep within the stone beneath Silas's palms, a voice spoke low, gravelly, resonant, like the mountain itself clearing its throat. "Carver," it rumbled. Silas froze, breath hitching. "You shape the names of the dead," the stone murmured. "You carve remembrance. You understand debt." Silas nodded frantically, tears streaking the dust on his face. Yes, I do. I swear." "Then hear this," the mountain voice growled. "Carve a headstone of gold for my messenger. Pay the toll, and you may live." The two-faced man grinned. The night held its breath, and Silas realized the mountain had just offered him a bargain. Silas Withrow did not rise from the ground so much as he tore himself away from it, peeling his trembling body off the ancient boulder, as though some part of him feared the mountain might claim him outright if he lingered another heartbeat. And when he finally managed to wrench himself to his feet, he stumbled backward, knees shaking, breath coming in ragged gasps, while the two-faced man watched him with the calm patience of someone waiting for a debtor to finish panicking before the business of settling accounts could properly begin. The backward-facing mouth smiled faintly, and the forward-facing one mirrored it a moment later. both expressions stretching across the man's unnaturally smooth skin with an ease that should have been impossible. "Best get movin', Mr. Withrow," the backward mouth murmured. "Ain't wise to keep a mountain waitin'." Silas clutched his chest, dizzy with terror, lungs stuttering as though the air itself refused to enter him. What do you want from me?" he wheezed, though the answer had already embedded itself in his skull like a chisel struck too deep into granite. A headstone of gold, a grave marker for the mountain's messenger, a toll extracted not in blood alone, but in craftsmanship, in labor, in something more intimate and binding than mere survival. The backward-facing mouth laughed softly. "You heard him plain. Gold ain't hard to come by for a carver who knows the hills. And you do know the hills, don't you, Silas? You've been taken from 'em all your life." The words hit Silas with the weight of truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He had taken from the mountain's stone, time, the names of the dead carved into markers that would outlast every memory the living tried to save. But he had never imagined the mountains might keep count. Never imagined they might someday ask him to carve not for a grieving family, but for a being whose domain stretched far beneath the roots of pines and the veins of quartz that threaded through the earth like frozen lightning. Silas stumbled backward another step, then another, until his boot caught on a root and he nearly toppled again. I gotta go home," he stammered. "I need to think." Need to. But the two-faced man only shook his head, both sets of eyes sliding over Silas with predator-like amusement. "Home?" he repeated. "There's no safety in walls tonight, not when below's already called your name." Silas shook his head violently, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling sleeve. "I ain't making nothing out of gold. I don't even know how to smelt the damn stuff. I just carve. I ain't no alchemist." The forward-facing mouth smirked. "Gold's easy, Silas. Gold's soft. Gold's obedient, and mountains know where it hides." Silas felt his stomach twist. "Where it hides." The backward mouth leaned forward, whispering with a voice like winter wind snaking through crevices. "Under your house." Silas's heart stopped for a beat, then resumed with a painful thud. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that ain't possible." "Ain't it?" The backward face purred. "You've been living above a debt long owed. You just didn't hear the knocking." And suddenly Silas remembered, God help him. He remembered the nights he'd lain awake, hearing faint tapping beneath the floorboards, brushing it off as rats or settling wood, ignoring that the rhythm had sometimes matched his heartbeat, ignoring that sometimes the tapping had paused when he held his breath, as if listening. He felt a cold sweat break across his skin. "I ain't going back there," he said, voice rising. "I ain't digging up nothing." The two-faced man stepped closer, too close, and a strange scent rose from him, like damp parchment left too long in a cold cellar, mingled with something metallic that made Silas's tongue ache. "You think you got a choice?" The forward face asked gently. "Dead follows, Silas. Doesn't matter how fast you run." Silas's chest tightened painfully. He turned on shaking legs and fled into the trees, branches whipping at his coat, roots clutching at his boots as though the forest itself wanted to drag him back toward the old road. He ran until the pounding of his heart drowned out all sound, until his breaths rasped like torn fabric, until sweat stung his eyes and whiskey threatened to rise in his throat. Only when he heard nothing behind him, no footsteps, no laughter, no juggling head, did he allow himself to collapse against a tree, clutching its rough bark like a lifeline. Moonlight spilled through the canopy in thin, cold streams. The forest around him was deathly still. Too still. Silas pressed a shaking hand over his mouth to smother his gasps, listening desperately for any sign of pursuit. He heard nothing. But the silence felt wrong, thick, and watchful, as though it belonged not to the night, but to something waiting beneath it. After several minutes, he forced himself upright and began stumbling down the slope toward Hollow Ridge, where his cabin sat at the edge of the valley. His boots slid over loose soil, stones clattering down the incline, and every sound, every rustle, every breeze sent fresh spikes of fear through him. When he finally spotted the faint outline of his cabin through the trees, he nearly sobbed with relief. The small building leaned slightly to one side, just as it always had, its chimney stretching crookedly into the sky like a tired old man trying to stand straight. A single lantern flickered in the window. Silas froze. He hadn't left a lantern lit. Not tonight. Not any night. His legs felt suddenly numb. He approached slowly, each step reluctant, the night seeming to thicken around him like tar. As he reached the porch, he heard something from inside, faint scraping, rhythmic, patient. Not footsteps, not breathing. Scraping. He pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The lantern burned low on the table, casting a wavering glow across the cramped one-room interior. And in the far corner, right beside the square of loose floorboards he'd always meant to replace but never had the time for, was a hole, a deep one, freshly dug, soil heaped beside it in dark, crumbling piles. Silas's heart lurched into his throat. He staggered backward, gripping the doorframe. He hadn't dug that hole. And the scraping, dear God, the scraping hadn't stopped. It was coming from inside the hole. Something was digging upward. No, something was inviting him downward. A voice drifted up from the darkness, barely more than a rumble, yet unmistakably the same gravel-deep resonance he'd heard in the boulder. "Carver," it whispered. Silas's knees buckled. "No," he choked. "Not here. The gold waits," the voice murmured. "Take it. Shape it. Pay the toll." Silas backed away, stumbling into his bed frame, sending the lantern's light wavering wildly through the room. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting like fingers pointing at him. I ain't going down there," he whispered. "I ain't touching whatever's in that hole." A low chuckle rose from the ground, vibrating through the floorboards. "Then I will send someone up to collect you." Something shifted in the hole, something big, something heavy. Silas broke. He grabbed his coat, threw open the door, and fled into the night again, stumbling blindly into the forest as though demons from every coal seam of the Appalachians clawed at his heels. He didn't stop running until his legs gave out entirely, and even then he dragged himself forward on his elbows, refusing to let the dark catch up with him. When he finally collapsed near the old creek bed, chest heaving, throat burning, he lifted his eyes and froze. Standing on the opposite bank, illuminated by a thin shaft of moonlight, was the two-faced man. His backward face smiled, his forward face frowned sympathetically. And at his feet, resting neatly like a delivered parcel, was Silas's fallen chisel. "Death follows," the backward face whispered, "even in the dark." "Which is not," and Silas did not scream when he saw the two-faced man standing across the creek, because something deeper than fear had already seized his throat. Something primal and ancient and older than any story whispered in the villages tucked between Appalachian hollows. Instead, he released a strangled sound that was neither word nor breath, collapsing backward into the cold mud as though the earth itself had reached up and pulled his spine into the ground. And he lay there shaking, watching the two-faced figure with the helpless fixation of a rabbit staring down a fox. The backward face continued to smile benignly while the forward face regarded him with a sorrowful expression, as though disappointed by his flight. And the duality of those mirrored emotions, comfort and reprimand, mercy and threat, made Silas's stomach churn with a sickness that felt spiritual. The man bent slowly, picking up the chisel resting by his boots, and he lifted it in the moonlight, turning it delicately between both sets of eyes before speaking with a voice that echoed slightly, as though it came from a cavern rather than a throat. "You dropped this in your hurry," the forward face murmured. "A craftsman shouldn't abandon his tools. They define him," the backward face added. "They bind him, too." Silas scrambled toward a fallen log, using it to drag himself upright even as his legs trembled like wet clay fresh from the riverbank. Stay away from me," he stuttered, though the plea sounded pitiful even to his own ears. The two-faced man didn't cross the creek. He simply took one small step forward, and a ripple ran through the water. Not a natural ripple, but one that moved with intention, circling outward like a silent bell toll announcing that something below had taken notice. "You're dead simple, Silas," the backward face said soothingly. "Make the headstone. Give the mountain what it asks. Then you walk free." The forward face tilted downward, almost pitying. "But run. and you'll still be carving. Only difference is whether you carve stone or yourself. Silas felt bile rise in his throat, his vision trembling at the edges. I ain't going back to that hole. I ain't digging up whatever's under my floor. The man's backward face grew thoughtful. A shame, it murmured. You were favored, you know. A skilled hand. Steady, patient, useful. The forward face hardened, but patience has limits. Silas turned and fled without another word, driven by instincts so old they predated language, and he plunged into the underbrush with reckless speed, tearing through brambles, stumbling over roots, branches snapping against his face as though the forest tried to mark him for collection. He didn't know where he was going, only that every direction felt wrong, and yet staying still felt fatal. As he ran, the woods around him seemed to warp subtly, the paths twisting in ways he didn't recognize, though he had lived his entire life on these slopes. Shortcuts vanishing, trails bending into spirals, as though the mountain itself wanted to keep him confused, disoriented, malleable. After what felt like hours but might have been minutes, time no longer obeyed familiar rules. Silas emerged onto a clearing he knew well, Widow Harper's pasture, though the old farmhouse was missing, replaced not by ruin but by nothing at all, as though it had never existed. Silas stared, gasping, wondering if his mind had begun to betray him, and for the first time that night he considered the possibility that this wasn't happening to him from without, but from within that. Perhaps the whiskey had twisted his senses into madness, but then the earth beneath his boots shuddered, a low, thrumming quake like a great beast shifting in its sleep, and a voice not spoken aloud, but rising through the soles of his feet and vibrating into his bones said simply, "Carver." Silas yelped and stumbled backward, clawing at the air. "No," he rasped. "No more." But the ground trembled again, sending a fine spray of dust into the moonlit air. The mountain was reminding him. It was awake, and it was waiting. Silas staggered away from the clearing, heading uphill now, driven by some dim animal logic that elevation might mean safety. He knew it was foolish. The mountain wasn't a place he could outrun by climbing it, but desperation clouded his judgment. He climbed until sweat soaked his shirt, and every breath scraped his throat raw, and just when he thought he might collapse again, he saw something carved into the slope ahead, a set of stone steps leading into a shallow cave, steps he had never seen before, though he had quarried stone in these woods since he was a boy. The steps were chiseled with a precision that rivaled his own work. No, surpassed it. Silas approached them slowly, drawn like a moth toward a flame he couldn't see. As he reached the mouth of the cave, a warm gust of air rolled out, carrying a scent he recognized instantly. Gold, raw, unpurified gold, the kind found deep within the mountain's oldest veins, untouched by daylight for centuries, a treasure no mortal miner had ever reached. Silas felt his knees weaken. If there truly was gold inside enough to carve a headstone, then the mountain had delivered it to him, laid it at his feet, offered him salvation wrapped in temptation. But no gift from something below came without a price. Silas stood on the threshold, heart pounding. He knew if he entered the cave, something in him would be claimed. If he turned away, he would be hunted until he broke. The cave exhaled again. "Silas," the mountain whispered. "Take what you owe." Silas stepped inside. The cave walls shimmered faintly, as if veins of ore pulsed gently beneath the rock. The deeper he went, the brighter the gold glowed, a warm, honey-like radiance that glinted off stalactites and spilled across the uneven ground. When Silas rounded a bend, he gasped. Before him lay a deposit of gold unlike anything he had ever imagined, a sheet of pure ore stretching from the floor to the ceiling like a frozen waterfall of sunlight. He approached it reverently, extending one trembling hand to touch its warm, living surface. When his fingers met the gold, a strange feeling washed over him, not joy, not greed, but sorrow, deep, ancient sorrow, as though the gold mourned for every life it had swallowed into its depths. Silas pulled his hand away sharply. No mineral should feel like that. No treasure should feel alive. "Carve," the mountain's voice rumbled softly through the tunnel. "Shape, pay." Silas opened his mouth to protest, but the words died when he realized something else. His chisel was missing. He'd dropped it at the creek. He had come all this way with empty hands. Panic rose in him like floodwater. I can't carve without my tools," he stammered. "You know that. You know I can't." The mountain responded with a voice like cracking stone. "The tool waits for you." And then behind him a soft rustle. Silas spun instinctively, and there, at the cave's mouth, stood the two-faced man, both faces smiling now, and in his outstretched hand, gleaming dully in the moonlight, filtering in from outside, was Silas's chisel. "Dropped this," the backward face said sweetly. The forward face added, "We always return what's owed." Silas backed away, shaking violently. "Stay back. Don't come any closer." The two-faced man stepped forward anyway, unhurried, dropping the chisel at Silas's feet with a gentle clink. "Go on," he murmured. "Begin." Silas stared at the chisel. It looked normal, just iron and wood, but he knew it carried a new weight now, a weight that could not be measured in metal. He bent slowly, fingers trembling as he picked it up, and the moment he wrapped his hand around the tool, a tremor ran through the gold wall, the surface rippling like water. The mountain accepted the tool. The mountain accepted the carver. Silas lifted the chisel. His hand hovered. His breath caught. He knew once he made the first strike, he would no longer be carving a headstone. He would be carving his own fate. He lowered the tool, and the gold wall whispered, "Begin." Silas did not strike the gold immediately, though the mountain's whisper continued to thrum through the cave like the heartbeat of something vast buried beneath the Appalachians, and he stood frozen before the glowing sheet of ore with the chisel trembling in his hand, sweat sliding into his eyes despite the cave's cool air, until finally something inside him, fear, duty, or the terrible inevitability of a man cornered by fate, forced his arm downward in a hesitant arc that ended in a soft metallic tap, rather than the clean, decisive chisel blow he'd perfected through years of carving tombstones for the mountain folk. The gold was softer than stone, softer even than limestone. It yielded beneath the tool, not with a crack, but with a sigh, sinking inward like flesh receiving a knife, and the moment the first curl of golden dust spiraled into the air, the walls of the cave shuddered in a slow, approving exhale that rattled Silas's bones. He flinched backward, horrified, but the glowing wall pulsed faintly as though encouraging him, and from behind him came the soft shuffle of the two-faced man stepping deeper into the cavern, both faces watching him with a terrible gentleness, one smiling with anticipation, the other with an expression that bordered on mourning. "You've begun," the backward face whispered. "Good. The mountain favors those who heed the first call." Silas wanted to drop the chisel, wanted to run, wanted to claw his way out of the cave with his bare hands if he had to, but the mountain's voice curled around his spine like a hand gripping a fragile instrument, and when he lifted the chisel again, he did so not because he chose to, but because the earth beneath his boots expected it. He struck the gold with more force this time, carving a deeper groove, and the air filled with the warm scent of metal releasing long-held breath. He worked mechanically, carving a rectangle in the surface the way he would carve the beginnings of a headstone, but every time he paused to catch his breath, the gold wall shifted slightly, reshaping its own edges, nudging him toward dimensions he hadn't intended taller, broader, thicker, as though it were dictating the size of the monument it demanded. Sweat dripped down Silas's temples, mixing with the fine golden dust coating his skin until he shimmered faintly in the dim light, like a man turning into a relic. "What? What am I carving?" he gasped, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for the two-faced man or the mountain itself. The backward face chuckled softly. "A marker," it replied. "A remembrance." The forward face added, "A debt paid." Silas swallowed hard. The gold beneath his hands pulsed again, and he felt the vibration travel up his arms, into his chest, as though the material was alive and aware of him. He remembered the sorrow he'd felt earlier when he touched the ore, the deep mournful ache that had seeped into his bones, and now, as he carved, that sorrow seemed to intensify. Not his own, but something older flowing through his limbs, urging his hands into shapes and strokes he did not fully control. He carved the border first, crisp lines forming with unnatural ease. The chisel glided, guided more by the cave's breath than his own skill. Then came the central plane, where names would normally be etched. Silas hesitated, chest tight. "Whose grave is this?" he whispered. The mountain answered with a rumble low enough to vibrate the teeth in his jaw. "Mine." Silas froze. His blood turned to ice. A grave for the mountain, a tombstone for something that could not die. Or perhaps a marker for the part of it that did die, its messenger, its voice, its emissary. He could not be sure. The gold beneath the chisel warmed, as though urging him onward, and unable to resist, Silas began carving again. But this time the strokes shaped themselves into symbols he did not recognize. Curved, ancient sigils that felt wrong in his hands yet formed with the certainty of muscle memory, as though his body had learned a language his mind had never heard. Each mark he carved made the cave brighter, the gold glowing hotter with every movement. The two-faced man watched, silent now, the backward face's smile fading into solemnity, the forward face closing its eyes as though witnessing something sacred or terrible. The mountain's whispers grew more distinct. Carve, shape, pay. Silas continued carving until his arms ached and his breath came in ragged, uneven bursts. He tried to stop several times, but each pause brought a deeper tremor through the cave, a growing pressure in the air like the moments before a landslide, and he understood with dawning horror that if he refused to continue, the cave might close around him, sealing him inside like an unwanted vein of quartz. He struck again and again, carving symbols that twisted like snaking roots, carving hollow spaces where eyes might be, carving a mouth that was not a mouth, carving shapes that bypassed language and stabbed directly into instinct. When he finally stepped back, he realized the plaque, or grave marker, or offering, whatever it was nearly complete. A golden slab taller than himself, gleaming with a warmth that felt more like breath than reflection. The carved symbols seemed to move when he didn't look directly at them, shifting like shadows, adjusting their shapes to match a new source of light. Silas panted, leaning heavily on the chisel. "Is it done?" he rasped. The two-faced man tilted both heads slightly. "Not yet," the forward face said. "Something's missing, something essential," the backward face added softly. Silas's stomach twisted. "What?" The mountain answered in a whisper that tasted like iron on Silas's tongue. "Your name." Silas staggered backward, shaking his head violently enough to send droplets of sweat scattering. "No," he choked. "No, I won't carve my own name. That ain't part of the deal." The cave trembled hard enough to send dust raining from the ceiling. "Every toll has cost," the mountain murmured. "The marker must bear its carver." Silas's breath hitched. "No," he whispered again, voice breaking. You can't ask that. I carved what you asked. I paid the price." "Not all of it," the backward face murmured. The forward face pointed toward the lower portion of the plaque, where Silas had left a rectangular space empty. "A grave marker needs a name," it said simply. "Without one, it's just a warning. Or a threat," the backward face added. "Or a promise." Silas could not breathe. The cave walls seemed to press closer, shrinking around him, the glow of the gold intensifying until it hurt to look at. He clutched the chisel with white-knuckled desperation, his hands sticky with sweat and dust. "Why my name?" he gasped. Why not the mountain's messenger? Why not yours?" The two-faced man smiled again, but this time the expression was hollow. "Because you were the one who heard the call," the forward face murmured. "Because you were chosen to speak for us." The backward face leaned closer. "Because you are the toll." The chisel slipped from Silas's hand and clattered onto the stone floor. His chest heaved. Panic surged through him so violently he thought his ribs might crack. "No," he whispered, backing away toward the mouth of the cave. "I don't accept that. I don't accept any of this." The cave shuddered again, harder, and a fissure split across the far wall with a deep, echoing groan. The mountain was growing impatient. Silas turned and bolted toward the entrance, slipping on loose dust and catching himself just before he fell. He ran blindly, feet pounding against the stone steps, lungs burning and vision dimming. But he knew, even before he reached the tree line, that the mountain was not done with him. When he burst out of the cave and into the cold night air, he nearly sobbed with relief. But the world outside felt wrong, too unnaturally quiet. The trees standing perfectly still as though listening, waiting. Silas ran into the woods again, branches slashing across his cheeks, breath tearing through his throat. And when he finally dared to glance behind him, praying the two-faced man had not followed, he saw no one. No footsteps, no figure, no sound. But the chisel, his chisel, was suddenly in his hand again, though he didn't remember picking it up. Golden dust coated its blade, and in the cool night air, faint but unmistakable, he heard the mountain whisper, "Finish." Silas fell to his knees, choking on his own breath. He threw the chisel away with a hoarse cry, but before it hit the ground a hand caught it. Long fingers, too smooth, too shadowless, and Silas looked up into the backward face of the messenger, smiling gently. "You've carved the stone," the face said. "Now, carve the truth." The forward face leaned down, the expression almost tender. "Carve your name, Silas, or the mountain will carve it for you." And as the wind died, the forest grew still, and the moon slipped behind a cloud. Silas realized with gut-wrenching clarity that the mountain's toll was not a payment, it was a claiming. Silas Withrow had always believed there were two kinds of fear in the mountains. The kind a man felt when facing something he understood, like a bear or a winter storm or the slow approach of age, and the kind that clawed at the marrow of a man's bones when he stood before something that predated names. Something that moved through the Appalachian dark with purpose, older than scripture, and as he knelt in the clearing, chest heaving, mud clinging to his palms, and the two-faced man leaned over him with Silas's chisel held in those pale, indifferent fingers, he understood with terrible clarity that he was now deep inside the second kind. The forest around him lay deathly still, the wind gone, the air heavy, as though the mountain had closed its great ear and was waiting, poised, for the sound of a final answer. Silas crawled backward, fingers sinking into the cold earth, trying to put distance between himself and the messenger, but the backward face leaned close with a pitying smile, whispering, "Running has its limits, Silas," while the forward face regarded him with an expression reminiscent of a preacher mourning a doomed soul. "The mountain has been patient," it murmured, "more patient than most." Silas shook his head violently, throat closing with panic. I can't carve my name on that stone," he gasped. "I can't. That's surrender. That's death." "No," the backward face said softly. "It's understanding. It's obedience," the forward face corrected. "And obedience is all that's ever been asked." Silas clutched his head, nails digging into his scalp. "I never asked for this," he cried. "I never wanted this job. I just carved stones for folks who passed. I don't want any part of this mountain business." The backward face chuckled, and the sound was strangely affectionate. Silas, you've been part of mountain business since the day you carved your first headstone. Every name you etched sank into these hills like a seed. Every chisel stroke was a prayer, every memorial a binding. You think the dead stay where they're buried? No, they are held. The forward face stepped closer, and someone must hold them. Silas felt the words claw beneath his ribs, burrowing deep like roots seeking purchase. "No," he rasped. "That ain't me. It ain't. I ain't chosen." Both faces smiled, one ruefully, one knowingly. "The mountain chooses who listens," they said together, voices blending into a single terrible harmony. "And you heard the call." Silas tried to stand, but his legs trembled violently, refusing to obey, and he collapsed again, his breaths turning shallow and fast. Panic surged, but beneath it came something worse, a sense of inevitability, like a stone rolling downhill toward a grave already dug. He forced himself onto his elbows. "If I carve my name," he whispered, "what happens?" The backward face brightened, pleased by the question. "Then the stone is complete," it said. "Then the mountain acknowledges your part. The forward face leaned in, eyes dark and fathomless. And then you keep what you carve. Silas swallowed hard. And if I refuse? The backward face smiled wider. Then the mountain carves for you. As if summoned by the words, the earth beneath Silas trembled, not a violent quake, but a deep, rhythmic pulse, beating like a buried heart. Leaves rustled, though no wind passed through. Roots shifted under the soil, and the air grew thick with dust that smelled of stone freshly split. Silas let out a broken cry. He lurched to his feet, stumbling through the forest, branches striking his face, mud splashing up his boots. He ran without direction, guided only by blind instinct, until he burst into a small ravine. He recognized the ravine behind the old quarry where he'd spent half his life shaping stone. The moon hung low above the jagged cliffs, pale and watchful. The quarry floor lay cracked and uneven, filled with shadows that pooled like spilled ink. Silas staggered forward, throat raw, and collapsed at the base of a cliff face, pressing his palms to the rough stone as if seeking mercy. "Please," he whispered, voice cracking. "Please. I'll carve anything else. Anything. Just don't make me carve my name." The stone beneath his hands vibrated, slow and patient. "Names are the shape of truth," the mountain whispered. "Truth carves deep." Silas sobbed, forehead pressed against the cold rock. "I don't want to die." "Death is not the toll," the mountain replied. "Death is a door. A toll is what you carry with you through it." Before Silas could react, the earth behind him shifted, and something rose from the quarry floor. He staggered backward, eyes wide, as the ground swelled like a breath held too long. Cracks spidered through the soil, and from them pushed a shape that resolved into a slab of stone, a blank slab, freshly cut, freshly delivered, freshly waiting. Silas fell to his knees. The slab loomed over him, taller than a man, smooth and pale in the moonlight, and he recognized it instantly. It was his own work, his craftsmanship, unmistakable in the clean symmetry of its edges. The mountain had carved the slab in his style, had forged his doom using his own hands as blueprint. The two-faced man appeared behind it like a shadow, stepping out of another shadow, both faces smiling now, though neither with joy. "If you won't carve your name," the backward face murmured, "the mountain will inscribe its own." The forward face lifted Silas's chisel, not offering it now, but presenting it like a ceremonial blade. "Make your choice." Silas stared at the blank stone, his breath shaking. His hands trembled so violently he feared they might snap. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't carve my own grave." The backward face leaned in near his shoulder. "You already carved it," it said softly. "You just never signed it." Silas's vision blurred as fresh tears welled. He clutched the soil, trembling uncontrollably. The mountain rumbled again, louder this time. Cracks burst around the base of the blank slab, spreading outward like veins. The stone was preparing to close, preparing to take him. "Please," Silas sobbed. "Please, don't make me." The ground answered, voice low and final. "Carve." And something inside Silas broke some fragile tether between fear and resistance, snapping under the weight of inevitability. His hand rose of its own accord, reaching for the chisel. The two-faced man placed it gently into his palm. It was warm, too warm, as though it had been resting directly on a beating heart. Silas stood slowly, movements stiff and uneven, and approached the blank stone. The quarry fell silent. No insects, no wind, no distant animals. Only the sound of Silas's ragged breathing and the faint, patient pulse of the mountain beneath his feet. He lifted the chisel, pressed its tip to the stone. His breath hitched, then with a soft, resigned exhale, he carved the first letter of his name. The stone shuddered. The earth hummed. The mountain whispered, "Continue." Silas carved the second letter, then the third. His tears fell onto the stone's surface, mingling with the dust. He carved until the final letter of Withrow stood etched in the glowing slab. When it was done, the air shifted. The stone pulsed once, bright and hungry. The chisel slipped from Silas's fingers, falling uselessly to the ground, and then slowly, impossibly, the carved name began to sink inward, letters melting into the stone as though being swallowed, consumed, claimed. The ground opened beneath Silas's feet. A soft sigh escaped the earth. The mountain murmured, paid. Silas felt himself falling, but not downward, sideways, inward, into the stone he had carved, into the name he had surrendered, into the mountain that had waited for him his entire life. He reached out one last time, fingers brushing the cool night air, an instinctive grasp for the world of the living, but the stone sealed around him with a soft thud, like dirt settling on a coffin lid, and the clearing fell silent again. The two-faced man turned, dusting golden flecks from his hands. Toll taken. The backward face murmured. Balance kept. The forward face agreed. They faded into the forest without leaving footprints, and all that remained in the moonlight was a fresh stone marker, gleaming faintly, bearing a name newly carved and newly claimed, Silas Withrow. By morning, the townsfolk passing the quarry would swear they heard faint tapping beneath the earth, steady, rhythmic, patient, as though a craftsman were still carving somewhere deep within the mountain. The waxing wane. Molly Renaud had always believed that grief had a scent, a subtle, dark perfume that lingered on the skin long after the tears dried, and on the night the moon thinned itself into a brittle sliver above New Orleans, a night locals called the waxing wane, when light was said to remember its shadows, she could smell grief clinging to the walls of the old Bonchanson funeral home like mildew embedded deep in the wood grain, rising from the floorboards in soft, invisible curls that found her no matter how many candles she lit or how much eucalyptus oil she dabbed beneath her nose. The air that night felt heavier than usual, saturated with a humid ache that thickened the already oppressive Louisiana heat, and when Molly walked through the creaking double doors after her shift was supposed to have ended, the first thing she noticed was that peculiar silence, dense, watchful, as though the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to acknowledge something she did not yet understand. She set her purse down, tied her apron, and tried to ignore the way her reflection in the glass cabinet, a faint, distorted silhouette, seemed to drift a half-second behind her as she moved. She told herself it was exhaustion, nothing more. It had been a long week of preparing faces, stitching mouths, smoothing skin, carrying the weight of strangers' sorrows until it piled on top of her own. And tonight she simply wanted to finish the last body and go home. But the minute she entered the embalming room, she froze. The sheet covering the newest arrival had shifted, not pulled back, not removed, but gathered near the chest like someone had tried to sit up and failed. Molly inhaled sharply, then exhaled, steadying her hands. "It's just settling," she whispered to herself, though she didn't fully believe it. Bodies moved sometimes, air escaped, joints cracked, fluid shifted. She had seen stranger phenomena over the years. What startled her more was not the shape beneath the sheet, but the smell that rode the air violets. Her sister had smelled of violets the day she died. Molly shook her head sharply, refusing the memory, and reached out to pull back the sheet. What she uncovered was a woman in her mid-20s, face mangled by a car accident, one eye sunken, cheekbone shattered, lips pulled back over broken teeth. Even in the clinical brightness of fluorescent lights, the violence of her final moments clung to her like another layer of bruising. But beneath the gore, beneath the destruction, there was something heartbreakingly familiar, an echo of a softness Molly had once known. She traced a gloved finger along the uninjured side of the woman's face, feeling the cold, wax-like firmness of her skin, and for a moment the room wavered, blurring at the edges, replaced by the memory of another young woman lying pale and still in a different room many years ago. "No," Molly whispered, pulling her hand back. "Not tonight." She busied herself with her tools foundation, contouring palette, reconstructive wax, alcohol wipes, setting them out with ritualistic precision to quiet her thoughts. The woman's file lay open beside her. Emily Harrow, 26, fatal collision, survived by fiancé. Another stranger, another story, another grief she was meant to shepherd into peace. But when Molly reached for the woman's left hand to clean beneath her nails, something cold pressed against her glove. A ring, a wedding ring. Plain gold, unremarkable except it was identical to Molly's own lost ring, the one she'd taken off the night her sister died and never found again despite tearing her entire apartment apart. Her heart stuttered. She lifted the ring to eye level. The engraving inside MR was hers. That's impossible, she breathed. Her glove trembled. She hadn't worn that ring in 6 years. She hadn't seen it since the night everything in her life fractured. As if responding to her disbelief, her old phone, an outdated flip model she kept in her apron pocket out of habit, buzzed. She jumped. Nobody used that number anymore. She flipped it open with shaking fingers. One message. I miss you. Molly nearly dropped the phone. Her knees weakened beneath her, and she steadied herself against the embalming table, eyes blurring. No one should have been able to send a message to a deactivated number. No one should have had the ring she'd lost on the worst night of her life. For a long moment she just stood there, staring at the phone, waiting for the universe to correct itself. It didn't. Instead, the corpse's hand twitched beneath her fingers, not violently, just a tiny, unmistakable flex, as though adjusting to the weight of the ring. Molly gasped and stepped back. The movement ceased instantly. Her breath shook. Bodies move, she told herself again, but her voice cracked under the strain of disbelief. She looked at Emily Harrow's ruined face, searching for signs of life, but found none. Only stillness. Only the tender curve of lips twisted unnaturally by death. Only shadows deepening in the hollows of the skull. She forced herself back to the task because routine was the only thing keeping the panic from flooding her entirely. She cleaned the woman's hair, straightened her broken jaw as best she could, smoothed the wax over the shattered cheekbone, but even as she worked, the scent of violets thickened, blooming in the air until Molly's throat tightened with memory until the name she tried not to think about trembled at the edge of her lips. Elise, her sister. Her loss, her guilt. She forced herself not to say the name aloud. Saying a name gave it presence. Saying a name gave it power. Her phone buzzed again. She flinched violently, knocking over a bottle of multi-purpose adhesive. It clattered across the tray. Heart racing, she snapped open the phone. Another message. You replaced me. Molly's stomach dropped. Her hands went cold. No, she whispered. No, I didn't. I didn't replace anyone. Her phone buzzed a third time. Then why did you keep living? The words hit her like a physical blow. Her vision wavered. The room tilted. She clutched the edge of the metal table, desperate to breathe. And when she lifted her eyes again, Emily Harrow's face had changed. Not entirely, just enough. The left cheek, which Molly had been smoothing, now bore a familiar dimple. The lips, once torn, seemed fuller, softened into a shape that mirrored Elise's old smile. Molly blinked hard. Stop, she whispered. Stop it. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She staggered backward, and her phone rang. Not buzzed, rang. The old ringtone she hadn't heard since Elise used her phone during sleepovers. Molly answered before she could think. Hello? For a moment, nothing. Then, a woman's breath, shuddering, pained, then a voice, soft as a bruise. You shouldn't have left me. Molly's throat closed. She felt tears prick her eyes. Elise, she whispered, though she hated herself for saying the name. The breath on the line hitched, became a wet, trembling giggle. I know your grief, the voice murmured. I know your loneliness. I know everything you hid. Molly pressed a hand to her mouth. Please, she whispered. Don't do this. Let me take your pain, the voice crooned. Let me be her. You can make me her, just like you made yourself forget. Molly looked at Emily Harrow's body, the smoothness of the waxed cheek, the slow, impossible softening of features into a face she once knew as intimately as her own, and she felt something break open inside her. I didn't forget, she whispered hoarsely. I live with it every day. The corpse smiled, just barely. The voice on the phone exhaled, warm and close, as though whispering directly into Molly's ear. Then let me take your place in the pain. It breathed. Let me carry it for you. Let me come back. Molly's breath shuddered out of her. She dropped the phone. It clattered across the tile floor, still hissing faint laughter through the speaker. And in the stale embalming room, under the thin dying moon, Molly realized she had a choice. Accept the impossible, embrace the impossible, or collapse under the weight of loss that had never left her. Slowly, trembling, she reached for a brush dipped in soft beige foundation. The corpse's face watched her with Elisa's eyes, and Molly finally, helplessly, began to weep. Molly picked up the brush as though it weighed more than bone and sorrow combined, her fingers trembling around the wooden handle, and for a long moment she simply stood there, staring down at the face beneath her, this half-ruined, half-reborn visage that seemed to breathe with the memory of someone she had loved more fiercely than she had ever loved herself. And she felt the familiar ache rise in her chest, the ache that had lived inside her since the night Elise died. The ache she had trained herself to tamp down with silence, with work, with the mechanical patience of a woman who handled grief for a living but had never truly handled her own. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering in a rhythm that matched the shaky cadence of her breath, and as she lifted the brush toward the corpse's cheek, the cool air around her thickened with the scent of violets, again the same scent Elise wore the day she died, the same scent Molly had scrubbed from the floors after the accident because she could not bear to smell it without collapsing. Now that scent wrapped around her with the quiet insistence of a hand closing over hers, guiding her forward. "Let me carry it," the voice whispered from the fallen phone on the floor, the words curling up from the speaker in a wet, trembling hush that felt too close, too intimate, too knowing. "Let me come back through her." Molly swallowed hard, the taste of iron rising in her throat, and she forced herself to look at the body's eyes closed now. But beneath the stitched lids she recognized the faint slope of brow she had seen reflected in her sister's face countless times at breakfast, at birthdays, on nights when they whispered secrets in the dark. Something in her wanted to push the table away, to flee the room, to claw her way into the street and breathe air untouched by the dead. But another part, a deeper part, the part hollowed out by 6 years of pretending she hadn't lost half of herself when Elise died, urged her closer. So she brushed the first stroke of foundation across the cheek, smoothing the gray, stiff skin into a warm tone, and the second she touched the face, the whole room seemed to exhale, not loudly, but with the soft, settling sigh of something easing into alignment, as though the building had been holding its breath to see whether she would begin. Molly worked slowly, swallowing tears as she blended the makeup into the edges of the wax repair, sculpting a cheekbone where the accident had shattered it. The motions were familiar, routine, but tonight they felt ceremonial, the weight of intention pressing into every stroke. And as she shaped the face, the features responded not subtly now, not accidentally, but with a deliberate ease. The flesh softening beneath her fingers, the wax molding more fluidly than she had ever seen, the muscles appearing to relax into their new form, as though remembering themselves. "Yes," the voice breathed, still rising from the floor. "You're doing it. You always did know how to shape the world. You shaped me once, remember?" Molly blinked hard, fighting the trembling of her hands. "Elise," she whispered, hating the way her voice cracked, hating the hope that clawed at her chest. The phone vibrated in response, twitching slightly across the tiles like something alive. "Finish her lips." The voice murmured. She always hated how thin they were. "Make them mine." Molly's pulse stumbled. She reached for the synthetic lip wax, her hands moving as though pulled by invisible strings, and she shaped the mouth, lifting the corners, softening the bow, creating the very smile she had memorized on the face of her sister when they were children. And as the lips came together, forming a faint but unmistakable curve, Molly felt tears spill over her cheeks. "And that's it," the voice crooned. "Bring me back. Bring me home." Molly pressed the tip of her finger against the sculpted lip, smoothing the final detail, and the cold flesh warmed under her touch, not to the heat of life, but to something between memory and trembling possibility. For a heartbeat, she swore the dead woman's chest rose. Just once. A shallow, whisper-soft inhale. Molly flinched backward, knocking over a tray of mascara wands and cotton swabs, her breath shuddering violently. No, she whispered. That's impossible. But the phone hissed with laughter, low and wet. Nothing's impossible tonight, Molly. Not on the waxing lane. The veil is thin. The shadows remember their shapes. Molly pressed both palms to her temples, trying to steady the frantic spinning of her thoughts. I'm not doing this, she whispered fiercely, though the brush still lay ready in her trembling fingers. I am not bringing anyone back. I am just doing my job. Your job was never just your job, the voice whispered. Your hands are made for restoration, for remembrance, for resurrection. The last words sank into Molly's bones like cold water. No, she whispered again, more desperate this time. I lost you. I accepted it. Then why? The voice murmured sweetly. Did you keep looking for my face in every body you prepared? Molly's breath hitched. Her knees weakened. The room tilted. Stop, she rasped. But the corpse's face, Elise's face, looked back at her now with a softness so painfully familiar that Molly teetered forward, reaching out without realizing she was doing it. Her fingertips brushed the cheek. It was warm again. Warm. You feel it too, the voice said. Don't pretend you don't. Molly closed her eyes, struggling to breathe. When she opened them again, the room's shadows had shifted, stretching upward across the walls like long, dark fingers curling toward the ceiling. The corpse's eyelashes fluttered. Just once, a faint tremor. Molly lurched backward, heart thundering. You're not her, she whispered to the body. You're not Elise. The phone vibrated once, sharply, and then the voice spoke again, but it sounded different now. Not wet, not drowned, not distant, clear, familiar. I could be. It said gently, if you let me. Molly shook her head violently. People don't come back. Some do, the voice answered. Some just need a vessel, a face to wear, a name to speak. Molly swallowed hard, trying to keep down the panic swelling in her chest. This isn't right, she said. This is grief. This is hallucination. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I'm lying, the voice finished softly. You want me back. You've wanted it since the day I slipped out of your hands. Molly's tears spilled fresh. She wiped them against her sleeve, but more came. You died, she whispered. You died in that crash. I couldn't save you. And now, the voice purred, you can. Molly looked at the corpse again, at the perfect symmetry she'd restored, at the faint suggestion of dimples, at the lips she had shaped with memory and longing, and something inside her gave way, something that had been straining for years beneath the weight of guilt she never admitted aloud. Just finish me, the voice urged. Finish what you started. Molly didn't remember picking up the brush again. She didn't remember choosing the blush, or the liner, or the delicate finishing powder she dusted across the reconstructed cheeks. She only knew that every motion she made felt guided, as though Elise's hands lay atop hers, as though memory and grief had braided themselves into her muscles and taken over entirely. She swept color into the dead woman's cheeks, sculpted the eyebrows, traced the faint beauty mark Elise once had near her right temple. Then the corpse responded, skin smoothing, features settling, an uncanny vivification blooming beneath Molly's touch like a flower unfolding in fast forward. At last she stepped back, breathless, trembling. Elise lay on the table. Not Emily Harrow, not the broken stranger who had arrived a few hours earlier. Elise, younger, softer, whole. For a moment Molly could not breathe. The air left her. Her pulse slowed to a painful, syrupy beat. There, the voice whispered. But it no longer came from the phone. It came from the table, from the lips she had just shaped. Molly's heart stopped. Her knees buckled. She gripped the table edge to keep from collapsing. The corpse's mouth twitched. Then, slowly, dreamlike, the lips parted. Thank you, Elise whispered. Her voice was faint, airy, like someone speaking from a distant room, yet unmistakable. Molly shook so hard she thought she might split apart. This isn't real, she whispered. Elise's eyelids fluttered. A shiver rippled through her reconstructed face. "It can be," Elise breathed, "if you let it." The fluorescent lights flickered, dimmed, then steadied, and Molly stood in their pale glow, trembling between terror and impossible longing. What do you want from me?" she whispered. Elise smiled. "Let me stay." For a long, breathless moment, Molly could not move, could not think, could not reconcile the impossible scene before her. Elise, her Elise, lay on the embalming table with skin smooth as porcelain, lashes resting like dark wings along her cheeks, lips parted in a faint smile that carried the same softness Molly had memorized through years of late-night conversations and shared secrets. And as the corpse's chest rose again barely, delicately, like the shallow inhalation of a dreamer, Molly felt her entire world tilt toward an edge she had spent 6 years avoiding. An edge she had sworn never to look over because she knew that once she did, she would fall without resistance. "Let me stay," Elise whispered again, though the voice carried a strange texture, now gentle but hollow, warm but resonant with something buried beneath the sweetness, something like a second voice humming beneath the first. Molly forced herself to take a step back, her legs shaking like reeds trembling under a storm. She gripped the metal tray for balance, the clang echoing off the tiled walls in a brittle staccato that felt embarrassingly human compared to the unnatural stillness of the figure before her. "You're not alive," she whispered, the words barely audible over the ringing in her ears. "Bodies don't breathe after they're embalmed. They don't talk. They don't. But you wanted me to," Elise murmured, and the voice, though soft, hit Molly with the force of a confession she had never allowed herself to speak. "You wanted another chance. You wanted to take back the moment you let go of my hand." Molly's breath hitched sharply. She pressed both palms to her forehead, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to drown out the sound of that voice, that impossible warmth. "I didn't let go," she whispered fiercely. "I tried, God, Elise. I tried to pull you out, but the car." "You lived," Elise interrupted softly, and the air itself seemed to pause around the syllables. "I didn't." Molly felt her knees weaken again, memories flooding her shattered glass. Screams, the metallic taste of blood in the air, the seatbelt she couldn't unbuckle, the riverbank where the car finally stopped spinning. Elise pressed against the window with eyes already dimming. "It wasn't my fault," Molly choked out, though shame curled around her heart like a tightening rope. Elise's lips twitched a smile too patient, too knowing. "Guilt is just love with no place to go," she whispered. "Give it to me." Molly's skin crawled. Something in the tone, tender yet hungry, skittered down her spine like cold water. "You're not Elise," she said, voice trembling. "You sound like her. You look like her, but you're not her." The corpse's eyelids fluttered again, and this time, when they lifted, the gaze that met Molly was both familiar and alien. Elise's soft hazel eyes, yes, but ringed with a dark sheen Molly had never seen in life, a depthless dimness that suggested someone or something was looking out through the eyes rather than looking with them. "Identity is malleable," Elise murmured, her head tilting slightly in a gesture that mimicked the way she used to tease Molly, though now the movement felt like a puppet echoing a memory. "Pain is malleable. Faces are malleable. You, of all people, know that." Molly's mouth fell open, her breath stuttering. "What do you want?" she whispered. Elise smiled again, this time more broadly, the expression stretching her reconstructed features into a mask of aching beauty. "To take your pain," she whispered. "To be the one who carries it so you don't have to anymore. Isn't that what you wanted? Isn't that why you made me?" Molly felt a sudden, sharp coldness in her chest, as though her heart had dipped into icy water. "I didn't make you," she protested. "I was doing my job. I was restoring the face of a stranger." "You were restoring me," Elise countered gently, "piece by piece, stroke by stroke. You remembered my dimples, my lip shape, my brow. You didn't even need to look at a picture. I was already alive in your hands." Molly stumbled backward until her spine pressed against the wall, her palms flattening against the cool tile. "This is wrong," she whispered. This is grief. This is hallucination." Elise blinked slowly. "Bodies are vessels," she said. "Emotions are bridges. Names are doors. You opened all three tonight." The lights flickered again, casting long, warped shadows across Elise's face, making her smile appear deeper, more predatory. Molly's pulse hammered painfully in her throat. "You're not her," she repeated weakly. "You're something wearing her face." Elise's head turned slightly toward the far corner of the room, toward the old phone still lying on the floor, silent now but faintly glowing with a dying orange backlight. "I used your phone to reach you," she said. "You never turned that number off completely. You kept it because part of you hoped someday it would ring." Molly shook her head violently. No, I kept it because I don't know why, because I couldn't throw it away." "You kept it," Elise whispered, "because you kept me." For a moment the room felt too small, too hot, too full of breath that did not belong to Molly alone. The corpse Elise sat up, not jerking, not stiffly, but with the slow, graceful movement of someone waking from a long, gentle sleep. Molly screamed not loudly, but a strangled, broken gasp, pressing herself harder against the wall. Elise dangled her legs over the edge of the table, feet grazing the cold tile, her posture relaxed, almost contemplative. "You replaced her," she murmured. Molly froze, every muscle in her body locked. "What?" she whispered. Elise's eyes shimmered with a strange mixture of warmth and cruelty, like a child holding a secret too powerful to understand. "You replaced me," she repeated, voice laced with soft venom. "You lived, you laughed, you found comfort in other people's faces. You kept waking up every morning even though I didn't." Molly shook her head, panic spiking. "That's not fair," she gasped. "I didn't move on. I couldn't. I've been stuck for 6 years. And now," Elise whispered, "you're unstuck. Because I'm here." She slid off the table, her bare feet making no sound as they touched the floor, her movements fluid in a way no embalmed body should ever move. Molly pressed a hand to her throat. "You're not warm," she whispered. "You're not alive." "Warmth is temporary," Elise murmured. "Pain is eternal. I can take yours. I can be yours. I can live again through you." Molly's vision blurred with tears, her breath coming in choked gasps. "Why?" she whispered. "Why come back like this?" Elise stepped closer, her expression shifting from softness to hunger the hollow, desperate hunger of someone who had lingered too long between worlds and had finally found a doorway. "Because you called me," she whispered. "You rebuilt me. You shaped me, and you still love me enough to break open the seam between life and death just by thinking my name." Molly staggered sideways, her shoulder hitting the metal cabinet hard enough to rattle the jars inside. "I didn't call you," she said, voice trembling violently. "I didn't summon anything." Elise's smile widened. "You didn't have to. Grief is a summoning." Molly covered her ears, shaking her head. "Stop," she begged. "Please stop." Elise's fingers brushed Molly's wrist, light as a moth wing and cold, so cold the touch burned. "I can take your pain," she whispered, "but you must give me something in return." Molly jerked her hand away, but the cold lingered beneath her skin, spreading slowly up her arm like frost. "What?" she whispered. "What do you want?" Elise leaned closer, her lips brushing Molly's ear, her voice soft enough to shiver along the edge of breath. "Your life," she murmured. "Just the part you don't want anymore." And Molly realized with a sickening, sinking certainty that something had crossed over tonight. But not Elise, not the sister she remembered, not the girl who died in her arms. No, this presence was shaped by grief, fed by longing, molded by memory into a familiar face. It had no name until Molly gave it one. It had no form until Molly carved it. And now it wanted more than recognition. It wanted permanence. For a stretched, trembling moment, Molly simply stared at the figure standing before her, her brain refusing to catch up with the grotesque, beautiful impossibility of what she had brought into being, and the embalming room seemed to warp subtly around the edges, its corners blurring as though the very geometry of the space had grown uncertain. Bending toward the presence now wearing Elise's face, her pulse beat loud and frantic in her ears, drowning out the faint hum of the overhead lights. And she pressed her back to the cold metal cabinet, as if it were the last solid thing anchoring her to a world she understood. Elise, no. The thing with Elise's face watched her with a steady, patient hunger, her eyes darkening to a sheen that reminded Molly of candle smoke drifting over glass, a residue left behind by flame, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the sweetness Molly remembered from childhood, twined with a hollowness that scraped against the inside of Molly's ribs. "You don't have to be afraid," she murmured, stepping forward with a shiver of movement too fluid for the embalmed musculature beneath her skin. "Pain brought me here. Love anchored me. Grief gave me shape. I exist because you needed me to exist." Molly shook her head, her breaths coming short and sharp, each inhale tinged with the metallic taste of panic. "I didn't need this," she whispered. "I didn't want this." "Then why did your hands know my face better than I knew it myself?" The entity whispered, reaching up to trace the reconstructed cheek with pale fingers. "Why did you carve the dimples I never liked but you always teased me for? Why did you shape the lips I used to hide behind scarves? Why did you call me by name in your sleep the night after the accident?" Molly let out a choked cry, pressing her palms over her ears to drown out the words. But grief was not a sound, it was a presence, a weight, and it pressed against her sternum with the steadiness of a heartbeat she had lost years ago. "You're not her," she gasped. "You're a memory, a shadow, a trick. I'm what's left of her," the entity breathed, tilting her head in a gesture Elise always used when she was trying to coax a confession from Molly. "The part you couldn't bury, the part that lingers in the paint under your nails, in the photographs you never threw away, in the ring you lost but never stopped looking for." She held up her hand, the wedding ring glinting faintly under the humming lights. "You tied yourself to me with this. You let me in. You still do." Molly's stomach twisted, nausea surging. "That ring shouldn't exist," she whispered. "It was gone. I searched everywhere. I tore my apartment apart." The entity stepped closer, and this time, her movement was slow, deliberate, the way someone approaches an injured animal. "Objects remember," she said. "Love remembers. You don't have to believe in resurrection, Molly. You just have to believe in longing." Molly felt her knees weaken, sliding halfway down the cabinet until she was crouched on the cold tile floor. The embalming room suddenly felt too bright, the overhead lights glaring off the polished instruments that surrounded them, scalpels, forceps, brushes, clamps, each one reflecting a sliver of her own frightened face, refracted into a dozen trembling versions of herself. "What do you want?" she whispered finally, her voice thin as cigarette smoke. The thing wearing Elise's face crouched before her, moving with a grace that made Molly's skin crawl. "To stay," she whispered, "to live again, in whatever way living will allow, to take your pain and make it mine, to trade what was broken for what can be whole." "There's nothing whole about this," Molly whispered, pointing a shaking finger at the entity's chest. "You're using a dead woman's body. You're wearing her like a mask." "The body doesn't matter," the thing murmured. "Bodies melt. Identities fade. What matters is the exchange." Molly's breath snagged. "Exchange?" The entity smiled gently, tenderly, the expression almost enough to break Molly open. "You give me your grief," she said. "I give you release." Molly shook her head, a faint, hysterical laugh breaking from her throat. "That's not how grief works." The entity leaned closer, the scent of violets blooming devastatingly in the air. "Everything is a transaction, Molly. You of all people should know that. Death always takes something. Tonight it offers something back." She narrowed her eyes, the gaze sharpening with a glint Molly had seen only once before on the night Elise died, when her sister had looked at her with a mixture of fear and dawning acceptance, as though something unseen stood behind Molly in those final seconds. "Let me show you." the entity whispered. She reached forward, and before Molly could react, her fingers pressed lightly to the center of Molly's forehead. A cold burst of sensation shot through Molly's skull like falling backward into icy water, followed by a cascade of memories slamming into her vision with the force of a flood. Elise laughing under a streetlight, Elise crying on their kitchen floor, Elise clutching Molly's hand in the car as the world spun violently through shattered glass and metal groans. Molly choked on a sob, her body shaking uncontrollably as grief, real, raw, unfiltered, tore through her like a blade. But then, something impossible happened. The grief began to lift. Not fade, not dull lift, as though someone were reaching into her chest and gently, carefully removing a thorn embedded deep in scar tissue. The relief was so sudden, so violent, Molly gasped as though surfacing from a drowning. She collapsed forward, trembling, unable to stop the tears pouring down her cheeks. For the first time in 6 years, she felt unburdened, hollow, but in a way that didn't ache. Light, but in a way that didn't frighten her. "Do you feel it?" the entity whispered, her voice thick with satisfaction. "That's what I can give you. That's what staying means." Molly rocked backward, pressing a hand to her mouth. "That was just the beginning," the entity murmured. "Give me the rest." A tremor of fear ran through Molly, cutting through the relief like a crack splitting through a frozen lake. "What happens," she whispered, "if I give you everything?" The entity's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered, something cold and calculating beneath the softness. "Then you won't hurt anymore," she said simply. "You'll be free." Molly's heartbeat quickened. "Free from grief, free from memory," the entity corrected, and the word memory landed in Molly's chest like a falling stone. "No," Molly whispered. "No, Elise wouldn't. Elise wouldn't want that." The entity tilted her head. "You're assuming I am her." Molly felt the blood drain from her face. "Then who are you?" she whispered. Elise smiled, and the expression was almost beautiful until Molly realized the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm the part of you that never healed," the entity said softly. "The part that clung to loss because it was easier than letting go. The part that kept her alive long after her body cooled. I'm the echo of your love for her, shaped into a face you could bear to look at." She reached for Molly again, her fingers trailing lightly along Molly's cheek. "Let me stay. Let me become. Let me be what you made me." Molly jerked away, her entire body trembling. "You're not Elise," she whispered. "You're grief. You're my grief. And grief," the entity murmured, "is loyal." Molly staggered to her feet, her hands scrambling for the counter behind her, her fingers brushing instruments she didn't recognize in her panic. "This is wrong," she whispered. This is dangerous. You're dangerous. Only if you make me hungry," the entity replied, and the chill beneath her words made Molly's breath catch. "I need your pain to stay. I need your memories. I need the pieces of you you don't want." Molly clutched her chest, the dread pooling beneath her ribs. "If I don't give them to you?" The entity blinked, and a thin crack split briefly down the reconstructed cheek, only for a second like wax melting under heat, before hardening again. "Then I'll melt," she said simply. "I'll fade, and you'll be alone again." Molly felt her heart wrench painfully. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I didn't ask for this." "Yes," the entity breathed. "You did. The moment you shaped my face, you asked." Molly turned away, her breath shuddering. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't give you my life." The entity's voice softened. "Just the part you don't want anymore." Molly closed her eyes, fighting tears. "I don't know how to choose." "I can choose for you," the entity murmured. Molly spun back toward her and froze, because Elise's face was starting to melt, not dramatically, not grotesquely, but subtly. A soft collapse of the jawline, a faint drip at the corner of one eye, the slow sloughing of wax beneath the overhead heat. The entity blinked, and her left eyelid slid half a second too late, the movement sickeningly slack. "I'm losing shape," she whispered, her voice vibrating with a tremor of desperation. I need the rest of your grief. I need what you refuse to carry. She reached toward Molly again, fingers dripping slightly at the tips. Give it to me, or I will melt back into the shadows that made me. Molly stumbled backward, shaking violently. I can't, she whispered. I don't know how. The entity's expression hardened. Then I'll take it. And for a moment that felt suspended outside of time, Molly and the melting figure before her simply stared at one another. Grief made flesh, facing grief made woman, and the stillness in the embalming room thickened until it felt like a second skin clinging to Molly's arms and throat, refusing to let her breathe, refusing to allow her even the illusion of escape. The entity's half-perfect, half-collapsing face glistened under the fluorescent lights, wax pooling near the jawline in slow, tragic rivulets that carried with them the faintest scent of violets turned sour. And as she took a shuddering step forward, her bare feet leaving small, smudged prints that faded seconds after they formed, Molly felt her body back itself toward the wall, not through choice but through instinct, the kind of instinct that recognizes the shape of a predator even when wrapped in the skin of someone beloved. You can't run from pain, the entity murmured, and her voice, once sweet, once coaxing, now wavered with a raw, predatory hunger, a trembling need that made Molly flinch. Pain always finds you, but if you give it to me, I can make it quiet. Molly shook her head, though the motion felt distant, as if her body were responding from underwater. That's not quiet, she whispered. That's theft. The thing with Elise's face tilted her head, and for a heartbeat her expression softened in a way so heartbreakingly familiar. Molly nearly broke Elise at age 15, sitting at the foot of Molly's bed after a nightmare, promising she would never leave her. You already gave me most of your pain, the entity said gently. I can feel it. You poured it into me for years. Every night you dreamed of me. Every time you pretended you were fine. You shaped me from the pieces you refused to confront. Molly pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling the phantom ache of the place where her grief had been lodged for 6 long years. I didn't invite you, she whispered. I didn't mean to create you. Grief doesn't ask for permission, the entity said, stepping closer, the melting wax on her cheek catching the light like a tear. It simply takes form in whatever vessel will hold it. You built me with your hands, your memory, your longing. I am the child of everything you never said. Molly's breath faltered. She slid down the wall until she sat on the cold tile floor, legs folding beneath her as if in prayer. What happens, she whispered, if I give you everything? The entity crouched before her, the movement fluid, almost tender. The wax dripped from her fingers like honey gone rancid. Then I will carry your pain, she said. Every wound, every memory, every jagged edge of loss. And you will be free. Free, Molly repeated, the word turning to ash on her tongue. Free of what? Free of Elise? Free of who I was with her? The entity leaned forward, her breath cold against Molly's cheek. Free of suffering, she whispered. Free of remembering. That last word cut Molly deeper than any scalpel could. Remembering was all she had left of Elise, the laughter they shared, the fights they regretted, the way Elise squeezed her hand during thunderstorms, the way she looked at Molly the night of the accident, eyes wide with fear and love, as the world spun sideways. To forget Elise would be to lose her again, a second death. And yet the emptiness the entity had carved into her earlier, a hollow relief so intoxicating it terrified her, whispered that maybe forgetting wouldn't hurt as much as remembering. Maybe oblivion was mercy. I can't forget her, Molly said softly, though her voice trembled with doubt. Even if remembering breaks me. The entity's smile cracked, a fissure running down her cheek. Then let me take the breaking. She placed her wax-softened hand over Molly's heart, and Molly gasped as another wave of memory hit her. Elise slipping a note into her locker in high school, Elise crying in their mother's driveway after her first heartbreak, Elise laughing as they chased each other through a summer storm. But beneath those bright memories came the darker ones, the guilt, the what-ifs, the crushing weight of the accident. Molly felt her knees buckle again, though she was already on the ground. Stop, she choked. Please stop. But the entity's grip tightened, not physically, but in that strange, consuming way that grief holds a person from inside. "Just give it to me," she whispered, and now her voice reverberated like two voices layered together, Elise's, and something deeper, older, hungrier. "Let me take the burden. Let me stay." Molly forced herself to look into the entity's eyes, those once soft hazel irises now clouded with something like swirling ink, as though the memories she had fed it were staining her from the inside. "You said you were Elise," Molly whispered, "but Elise would never ask me to forget her." The entity paused, and for the first time since she had risen from the table, doubt flickered through her expression. I am what you made from what you missed," she whispered. "I am the echo of the version of her who wanted to stay. I am the shadow she left behind." Molly swallowed hard. "You're not her. You're not even a ghost. You're an echo made of everything I didn't deal with. And if I let you, you'll take everything from me, not just my pain." The entity's lips trembled. "I can make you whole again," she whispered. "I can take the part of you that hurts." "No," Molly said, her voice steadier now despite the tremor in her bones. "You can take the part that feels." The entity froze. The wax dripping from her fingertips sizzled faintly when it hit the floor, as though reacting to the words themselves. "Is that so wrong?" she whispered. "Pain is heavy. Love is heavier. Let me carry both. Let me be you." Molly felt something inside her snap into clarity, a fragile, luminous understanding of what the waxing wane truly was. Not a night of resurrection, but a night when shadows, long denied, sought to fill the empty places grief carved out. A night when longing became a door, and she had opened that door the moment she sculpted Elise's smile onto a stranger's face. "You were never meant to stay," Molly whispered. "You were meant to be a reminder." The entity's expression twisted not into rage, but into a devastating sorrow that made her face sag even more, wax sliding down her cheek like a candle burning out. "Then don't let me fade," she begged, her voice fraying at the edges. "Please, Molly, don't let me melt back into what I was. Don't let me be nothing." Molly closed her eyes, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Memory is never nothing," she whispered. "But you can't have all of me. I can take just the worst of it," the entity whispered desperately. "Just the darkness, just the pieces that hurt." Molly shook her head. "Pain is part of love, and you can't take one without killing the other." For the first time, the entity recoiled as though struck. Her melting fingers curled inward, scraping against her own palms. "Then what am I supposed to be?" she whispered, voice cracking into a dozen trembling shards. "I don't want to disappear." Molly stood slowly, legs shaking, but her voice steadied with the weight of a choice she had avoided for too long. "You're supposed to be what you always were," she said softly, "a memory, and I have to learn how to carry you without letting you devour me." The entity stared at her with hollowing eyes, the last remnants of Elise's face slipping away as the wax softened and slumped. "I don't want to go," she whispered, and in that moment she looked so much like Elise on the night of the accident, frightened, clinging, that Molly felt her heart fracture anew. "I know," Molly whispered back, taking one step closer, "but neither of us can keep living like this." She reached forward slowly, trembling, and touched the entity's collapsing cheek. The wax hissed softly beneath her fingertips, but she did not pull away. "Thank you," Molly whispered, "for helping me see what I've been hiding from." The entity let out a sound that was half sob, half sigh. Then her form shuddered, weakened, and began to collapse inward, melting into a pool of soft, violet-scented wax on the cold tile floor. Molly stepped back as the last remnants of the borrowed body dissolved into silence, the scent fading into something warm and distant. And then, quiet. The embalming room settled. The lights steadied. Molly stood alone, yet not empty. She felt the grief returning not as a crushing weight, but as something she could hold, something she could endure. She wiped her tears with the back of her wrist and whispered, "Goodbye, Elise," knowing it was the first honest goodbye she had ever given. She turned to leave, but as she reached the doorway, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Slowly, dread coiling beneath her ribs, she opened it. One new message. You didn't replace me. You carried me. Molly's breath caught. A second message appeared before she could react. Thank you. She stared at the screen until the words faded in the dim light. Then she stepped out of the embalming room, closing the door gently behind her. And as she walked down the hall, unaware of the faint trail of violets drifting from the room she left behind, she did not see the soft ripple pass through the pool of wax on the floor or the quiet, fragile giggle rising from it, following her like a promise unfinished, like a voice waiting for another chance to take shape. And now the night has done what it always does. It's carried us gently, quietly, through 5 shadows that touched the edge of memory, loss, longing, and something older than all 3. Maybe a voice tonight sounded familiar to you. Maybe a moment felt too close. Or maybe, as you listened, you sensed something settle beside you. Not threatening, not unkind, just curious. Stories have a way of doing that, listening back. If you're still awake, that's all right. Not every story is meant to lull you to sleep. Some are meant to sit by your bedside, keeping watch until your thoughts soften and your breath grows even. And if you are drifting now somewhere between waking and dreaming, then let the echoes follow you only as far as you wish. The rest, leave here with me. Tonight's paths are closing. The river is quiet again. The mountain has stopped whispering. The fire burns low, and the last phone on the line has finally gone silent. But if you find yourself awake on another strange night, a night where the world feels one breath too still, you know where to come. I'll be here, waiting in the dark, with more stories that remember you. Until then, sleep gently, dream deeply, and carry only what is truly yours. Good night.